Night air trembles above a quiet orange grove. Crickets stitch their thin music through the dark. A lone porch bulb hums. Beyond a picket fence, a boy draws with a stub of pencil on the back of a grocery bill. Lines, then an ear, then a mouse that seems to lean forward and listen. From somewhere down the road, a freight train moans like a tired giant, and its echo climbs the rafters of a small house where rent is late and hope is early. The boy's hand shakes when the pencil breaks. He pinches the splintered wood and keeps sketching anyway. The train passes. A new sound rises. Distant laughter like bells carried by wind. And the mouse smiles as if it already knows the trick of survival. To turn fear into a story, hunger into a map, and the empty night into a stage full of light. If stories like this move you, walk with us. Leave a quiet mark of support, and let's keep the light on together. A sketch on a napkin. The night train cut a narrow ribbon through the Midwest, windows like moving coins of light, and a young man with ink-stained fingers watched his reflection blur in the glass. He had a cheap suitcase, a suit that had learned every city bench in Kansas City, and a stack of drawings trembling with the car's sway. "We're not beat," he whispered to no one and to everyone who had believed him. His brother counting dimes by a dim bulb, his mother wiping her hands on an apron that smelled of soap and cinnamon, his friends who still slept on studio floors. The wheels hummed a steady answer. Not yet, not yet. He pressed 2 fingers to the paper as if the paper had a pulse. Somewhere behind him lay a collapsed studio with a cheerful name and empty ledgers. Somewhere ahead waited a town where the light felt warmer on the skin. He pictured a small shop, a borrowed camera, a desk by a window with the right kind of sun. He pictured a character, still fog, not yet bone. He did not know its name, only the feeling it would carry, mischief that healed, laughter that pulled people closer to each other and farther from their fear. Before the train there was a boy in a clapboard house where mornings began in ice. The whistle of a kettle sounded like a bird asking questions. "Walt, fetch the wood," his father called, voice brisk as the air. Elias counted minutes and pennies. Flora counted stitches and sighs. The boy fetched wood. He also fetched pictures from the white margins of old newspapers, copying the curve of a cheek, the arc of a hat brim, the tail of a letter that felt like a small road leading out of town. When dawn turned the kitchen window into a square of yellow milk, he stepped onto streets that smelled of coal dust and wet rope, and delivered newspapers until winter bit through the cloth of his sleeves. He learned the rhythm of doors, the weight of a town's silence, and how some faces brightened at a headline, while others tightened like a knot. After school, he traded pennies for pencils at a hardware store that knew him by name, then lost hours drawing cows that looked almost like cows, a train that looked exactly like Escape, and a mouse that listened as if it already understood everything. War came and found him young. He lied about his age for the Red Cross, and drove an ambulance painted with cartoons. The sides crowded with quick figures, trying to push back the world's grief, if only by an inch. He learned the taste of dust and the smell of canvas tents at dawn. He watched men fold letters as if each page were a prayer flag. In quiet hours, he drew faces and left them behind in mess halls and on crate lids, a strange currency that still bought something. Smiles, at least. Sometimes a short story told in a low voice, the kind that took no hero to tell, and made one anyway. When the guns cooled and the roads emptied, he came home hungry. Not for food, though plenty nights held only bread, but for work that felt like breath. Kansas City first, because it was near enough to grab. An advertising shop with a camera that sounded like a grasshopper, a friend with quick hands and a patient face, Ub, with whom he could talk in shorthand. If we could make it jump, the eye will fill the space. They lived on stew and stubbornness, slept folded like pocket knives, and rented a room for their dream. The room smelled of glue, turpentine, and the ghost of last week's coffee. A calendar on the wall kept score. A mouse in the baseboard kept time. Laughogram, they named it, because if you named a future out loud, the world might blush and hand it to you. They drew princesses with loose hair, cats with sly grins, old stories with new clocks inside them. Film curled and cracked. The projector coughed like a small engine climbing a hill. On good days, the pictures lifted off the screen and hovered in the dark, and the boys forgot to breathe. On bad days, a creditor's knock shook dust from the rafters. "We can pay Thursday," Walt promised, hating and loving the way hope made liars of honest men. Thursday arrived with a smile and empty hands. There was a letter. There are always letters. "Dear Mr. Disney," a distributor wrote, stiff as a starched collar, "we regret to inform you." And the rest of the sentence swung like a wrecking ball. A worker left. Another stayed and ate less. "We're close," Ub said, taking off his glasses to polish the lens of belief. Walt nodded and drew faster, as if speed could turn a wall into a door. But debts breed faster than dreams. The bank knows more about timing than the heart does. "We're done," the landlord announced, standing in the doorway, with a face that had learned to say no without blinking. Walt packed the camera as if it were a child, the drawings as if they were blankets. He locked the door to a room that had felt like a country and walked away without looking back, because looking back is a luxury for those who can afford it. Hollywood did not smell like the movies. It smelled like warm tar and orange rinds, like chickens and distant ocean, like everybody else's hunger mixed with everybody else's perfume. Roy, the brother with a careful mouth and a soldier's steadiness, met him at the station with a handshake that lasted a second longer than most. "We'll fix it," Roy said, and the promise felt like a bridge that could hold a horse. They rented a garage that leaked light in soft bars across the floor. A desk against a wall, a hat on a peg, a calendar without a single mark yet. Walt hung his jacket, rolled his sleeves, and set the camera in place. He wrote letters to anyone who might print them, knocked on doors that opened just wide enough to let a shadow in, and sold a little here and there, enough to buy more paper, more ink, another chance. In the corners of the garage, the dust glowed like small galaxies when the morning sun slid in. He felt both very small and very close to something large enough to live inside. Then came a character with long ears and a contract full of traps. For a while the rabbit ran fast, and the checks ran slow, and the studio began to look like a real place, with a bell on the door and names on envelopes. Laughter returned at lunchtime. The pencil sharpeners sang again. But a handshake turned out to be a lock, and the key was not in their hands. On a cold day in New York, a man with a polished smile explained what the paper had been hiding all along. The rabbit belonged to others. The artists could come along if they wished. The name on the door was welcome to stay where it was. Walt walked the city by himself with the same sick motion as a ship, dodging elbows, counting his money like sand in a fist. "We've lost him," he told Roy later, voice flat, eyes bright. "All of it." Roy did not flinch. "Then we make something we own," he said, and the sentence drew a straight line through a storm. On the train ride back, the window turned his face into a watercolor. He took out a pad. He took out a pencil. The cars clacked, the night murmured, and a small idea knocked. Not the rabbit, not the rabbit's shadow. Something quicker, rounder, friendlier, with buttons like dimes and a grin that could outlast sorrow. He smiled without moving his mouth. "A mouse," he said to the dark, testing the shape of the word. The dark did not answer. The train did, though, the way trains do, an iron rhythm that said, "Begin, begin, begin." The train's wheels hammered the promise into him all the way west, and by the time he stepped off into sun-smacked Los Angeles, the mouse had grown a temperament. Merry but stubborn, humble but fearless, the sort of friend who trips on the first step and somehow lands at the top of the stairs. Back in the garage-turned studio, he sketched circles as if building a compass that would finally point true. 2 big circles, one smaller, then ovals for feet that could dance and run and pause just long enough to look straight at you, as if to say, "We're in this together, aren't we?" Lillian, steady eyes, steady wit, watched the pages gather like fallen leaves. "Mortimer," he said, trying the name, and she shook her head with a smile that cut the string of formality. "Too stiff," she answered. Mickey. The room brightened by one candle's worth. Mickey, Walt repeated, and the name fit like a hat you forget you're wearing. Work stitched itself into days that had no edges. Ub bent over the drawing board with a patience that turned paper into breath. If the hand leads, the wrist will sing, he murmured, lining up stacks of clean sheets, rhythm, squash, stretch, anticipation. The quiet grammar of motion nobody notices when it's right. Walt paced, storyboarded with his voice, threw problems like balls into the air and caught most of them. Roy kept the ledger open, the door locked at night, and the wolves as far out as charm and arithmetic could push them. Cash on Friday, he'd say on Wednesday, if we can survive Thursday. The bell over the door learned 3 notes, clients entering cautiously, deliveries arriving late, and Hope stepping out for breath before returning with a grin. They made 2 silent shorts with the mouse, and the mouse did everything right, except save the studio. Exhibitors smiled, patted backs, and offered terms that turned to smoke when the projector cooled. People want sound, someone said one afternoon, as if sound were a fruit you could pluck from a winter branch. Sound meant new equipment, new skill, new debt. Yet the silence around them had grown too large to live in. Walt stared at a blank wall, listening to a world that wasn't yet recorded. The squeak of a wheel, the spit valve sigh of a trumpet, the tin lid crash of a pot on a stove, all of it knitting into something like proof. What if we could make them hear him think? He asked the room. Ub looked up, surprised and delighted at once. We'd need a conductor, he said. We'd need a metronome, said someone else. Roy did not look away from the numbers when he spoke. We'd need money we don't have. They borrowed. They promised. They traded the future for reels and microphones and sheets of music that smelled like freshly ironed shirts. The studio's walls became instruments. They hung blankets, built frames, and invited a small orchestra that tuned nervously, as if it could hear the ledger whisper. To time the impossible, they chalked marks on film and beat the air with batons. When the mouse lifted a pot lid on the screen, a percussionist lifted a real one and met the picture on the beat, a kiss of sound to image that felt like catching a falling glass without thinking. Laughter burst in the rehearsal room, relief, almost prayerful. Again, Walt said, his voice a saw its own sparks couldn't dull. Again. Outside, the world did what it always does. Measured bills by the week, favours by the hour, trust by the teaspoon. A letter arrived from a theatre owner who had seen the silent mouse and wasn't too sure. Too innocent, he warned, as if innocence were a dangerous chemical. Another letter arrived from a banker who was sure of something else. The collateral is intangible, as if dreams didn't weigh anything. Lillian brought sandwiches wrapped in newspaper and set them near the cello case. Eat, she urged, and the command landed like grace. Between bites, they invented syncopations for laughter and footfalls, gave rhythm to mischief, wrote silence where a breath belonged. The conductor, Wilfred, tapped his stand with the quiet authority of a forge. We'll ride the picture, he said, and the audience will ride with us. Premiere night came dressed in uncertainty. The marquee was not theirs alone. Their title hid mid-bill like a promise you make your own heart. Steamboat Willie, someone read aloud as if tasting it, and Walt pressed his palms together once, sharply, to steady himself. In the projection booth, the operator eyed the synchronization like a man watching a bridge in a storm. The house lights dimmed. The room folded itself into attention. First the whistle, high and impish. Then the mouse at the helm, body turning to music, hands spinning the ship's wheel as if conducting the river. A goat became a gramophone. A cat became a bass. Pots sang. Ropes clapped. The deck itself learned to dance. People laughed the way you laugh when you didn't know you needed to. Laughter broke across the theatre in clean, bright waves. Somewhere in the dark, Roy exhaled a month's worth of breath. Ub, who rarely smiled broad, grinned sidewise and let it stay. Walt listened harder than anyone, not to the sounds they had made, but to the sound beyond them, the murmur of belief shifting in a room, a collective heartbeat finding tempo. After, they drifted into the night street like ghosts learning to be human again. There were handshakes that meant contracts, and promises that this time carried weight. A reviewer's words walked beside them. A riot of fun, he had scrawled, ink still damp. In the quiet that followed applause, hope changed shape. It was no longer a bird that might fly away if you stared. It had landed. It had built a nest in their pockets and begun to sing through numbers on Roy Or's page. "We can hire," Roy said, almost tenderly. "We can breathe between Fridays." Back in the studio, the bell over the door found a new note, ambition clearing its throat. Success, though, is a horse that demands feeding and biting at once. New shorts, more music, tighter timing, a staff that doubled, then doubled again, a hive of desks where pencils beat time like rain. Walt, sleeves rolled, walked the rows like a farmer who knew each furrow by name. He stopped to listen, to a gag that needed one more frame, to a violin phrase that grazed instead of struck, to a young animator's joke that tried too hard and failed elegantly. "Fail funny," he suggested. "Fail forward." He wrote ideas on matchbooks, on napkins, on the backs of envelopes that carried the news of their own survival. He argued with himself out loud, and with others when needed, then sent flowers after hard words landed. The mouse became fluent in the language of the world. Curiosity first, courage next. Kindness as a trick that always turned out to be the point. Letters came now with different opening lines. "Dear Mr. Disney, my little boy. Dear Mr. Disney, I laughed till. Dear Mr. Disney, would you consider." An 8-year-old sent a crayon drawing of the mouse dancing with a broom. A soldier wrote from a base where routines dulled the edges of purpose. The cartoon had sharpened them again, if only for a night. On Saturdays, the studio doors opened to visitors who stood behind ropes as if near a ship's rail, watching artists sail blank paper into giggles. "This used to be a garage," one man marveled, and Walt thought, "We are all just rooms that learned music." But the appetite that success wakes cannot be soothed by repeats. The shorts began to feel like breathing into a paper bag. Useful, necessary, not enough. "A longer story," Walt said one evening, watching sunlight drain over the lot like watercolor. "A story they can live in for a while." Roy heard numbers loading into their future like crates. "We can't afford to be wrong," he warned. Ub considered the edges of what could be drawn and how such edges might bend without breaking. The staff, tired and exhilarated, wondered what their hands could carry and their nights could hold. Outside, the bell over the door trembled. Wind, or maybe an omen, or maybe just a reminder that doors mean risk before they mean welcome. Somewhere, a clock struck. Someone down the block laughed without a reason. Walt turned the word over in his mouth. Feature, as if it were a coin whose value he alone could see. He wasn't ready to spend it. He was almost ready to bet it. The studio became a small city of motion, and motion became a way to think. In the in-between frames, where a hand had to imagine how a smile arrived and how a blink went away, the team learned patience like carpenters learn grain. "Every laugh has a breath before it," an animator named Les said, tapping a pencil against his lip. "Give them that breath." Women in ink and paint rooms bent over cells that slid beneath their fingers with a glassy sigh, colours blooming in tiny lakes. They tied scarves back, hummed the same bars of music until the corridors seemed to carry a tune of their own, and taught themselves how light travelled inside a character's eye. Across the hall, a camera rig on a stand taller than a man groaned gently as it rose and fell, a crane lifting dreams. "Again from frame 342, someone called, and the machine obeyed, stepping through time like a careful giant. Walt watched, not from a throne, but from every chair he could borrow for 5 minutes. He leaned on doorframes as if listening to the grain of the building. He marked up storyboards with red pencil, drawing arrows like wind. Why does he care? He would ask, tapping a panel. Because she does, a writer answered, and the scene warmed by a degree. When tempers snapped, he walked the heat to the water cooler and returned with a joke he'd used before because it worked. We were not plumbers, but we can fix a leak. He kept a drawer full of candy for hard afternoons and envelopes for small raises when the company couldn't yet afford large ones. He sent his artists to zoos with sketch pads and to dance halls with eyes open, ordered books about anatomy and books about laughter, and asked for both to end up on the screen. With sound came another hunger. To colour the world, early tests bled wrong, reds too loud, blues too shy, but the promise was as bright as a parade. They made silly symphonies that treated nature as orchestra and joke as melody. Leaves spun, skeletons pranced, seasons turned in a handful of minutes, and audiences felt something odd and warm, that cartoons could sing about more than tricks. There's poetry in this, a critic wrote, surprised to find himself using that word for a mouse's cousins. I felt autumn. At night, the staff spilled into a diner where the coffee was modest and the pie was a reason to continue. Napkins sprouted thumbnails, serpents of story winding around ketchup bottles. What if a tree could remember being a seed? Someone mused. What if a broom could get tired? Another added. A waitress topped off cups and said, "You boys drawing the weather again?" They laughed and didn't deny it. Visitors multiplied. A mustached producer peered over cells and nodded like a metronome. A shy schoolteacher brought a class and whispered, "Watch the hands. That's where the magic hides." On Friday afternoons, pay packets thumped onto desks like small drums. Roy would stand at the window for a minute before going home, counting the lights left on and thinking of the ledger that matched each bulb's glow. "It's working," he told Lillian one evening, in a tone that could not decide between relief and warning. "It's working too well to stop," she replied, holding his gaze as if that fact were both blessing and load. The first time Walt said the words out loud, he did it softly so the idea wouldn't spook. "A feature," he told the room after hours, the clock over the door sounding like a cricket, a few heads lifted, eyes tired but willing. "All one story," he added. "A story that breathes, a story that hurts and heals in the same hour." He described a girl speaking to birds because people had refused to listen, a queen whose mirror told a truth she hated, a forest where fear had a colour you could walk through, and a prince who arrived not to save the day, but to remind it of itself. He didn't call it Snow White yet. He called it Risk, with a smile. Silence held the room, then broke, not with applause, but with the honest noise of craft. "It's impossible," a veteran said, meaning the schedule, the money, the sheer weight. "It's necessary," an assistant answered, surprising herself with the firmness of it. Ub pushed his glasses up and began to list problems. Camera depth, human faces, the dance between music and plot that must never step on toes. Roy brought his ledger like a shield. "We ride the edge already," he warned. "This would be the edge of the edge." Walt looked at his brother and saw not doubt but care. The older sibling's old promise trying to keep a roof between his family and the weather. "I know," he said. "I also know what the shorts can't do anymore." That night, after the doors were locked and the neon blinked its steady eyelid on the street, Walt walked the empty hallway alone. The building had a smell of warm paper and cold metal, both familiar as blood. He stopped in the ink and paint room, where the long tables slept under their lamps like ships at anchor. On a rack, 1,000 faces waited to be born tomorrow. He touched the corner of a cell with one finger, as if it could feel reassured. In the projection room, the chairs still held the indentation of a laughing afternoon. He sat and stared at the blank screen until the white became a fog in which shapes might appear if named. "A feature," he said again, just for the room to hear it and begin to plan its echo. The next days were a braid of argument and insistence. Bankers visited and smiled with their teeth, asking questions that had no poetry in them. How long? How many? How sure? Roy spoke the language of caution fluently and kept his brother from translating hope where numbers needed nouns. "We'll need everything," he told the banker, and in that confession was also an invitation to witness a mad, careful attempt. The banker's pen hesitated, as if listening for a song only some people were built to hear. He signed for a part, then for another part, then, shaken by contagious certainty, for more than he had planned to. Workers noticed new lines on Roy's forehead. "It's the roof," he joked when they asked. "I'm holding it up with math." Training began like a boot camp, only kinder. They built a multiplane camera to make flat worlds deep. The contraption purred like a patient panther. Artists drew apples until apples began to dream of being hands. They studied eyes. They studied rain. They watched dancers to learn where grace hides when a foot meets floor. A composer tapped themes on a silent keyboard before scoring the spaces between moments. Messengers ran. So did rumors. "They're going to sink," a man at a rival studio declared. "They're going to fly," a woman in ink and paint insisted, cutting a perfect arc of blue. And the mouse watched, not jealous, almost proud, as if a firstborn stepping aside for a sibling. Mickey kept working, because a home needs bread as much as visions, and lent his cheer to the long hours. He whistled through other shorts while a new world gathered on the big boards. At home, Lillian folded worry into patience and packed sandwiches to smuggle time back to the studio. "Eat," she said again, "and blessings don't wear out if you use them." One evening, when the weight pressed so hard it left dents, Walt stepped outside. The lot was quiet, except for a cat arguing with a nightbird and a far-off streetcar moaning its way home. He could smell orange blossoms under the tar and the slow cooling of the day's machines. A janitor named Hank paused with his broom and nodded. "You look like you're listening for thunder," Hank observed. "I'm listening for tomorrow," Walt answered, and the janitor grinned. "Same thing some days." He closed his eyes and pictured the first frame of the long story. A book opening, pages gilded like promises, music that sounded like a hand extended without demand. He pictured the last frame and refused to name it, as if naming might scare it away. He walked back in, lighter by an ounce of doubt, heavier by a pound of resolve. The door sighed shut behind him, and the building took a breath. One of those deep ones a body draws before a run. The pencil met paper. The baton met air. The ledger met ink. The phone lines carried both mercy and threat in equal measure. Somewhere, an investor cleared his throat. Somewhere else, a child fell asleep with a mouse printed on his pajamas and woke with joy for no measurable reason. On a work table in the center of everything, a new story put out its hand. A forecast gathered over the studio. Dark, electric, expensive, and the air tingled with the kind of charge that either powers a city or blows the fuses. They were about to find out which kind of storm they had invited. They called it a plan because prayer would have scared the bankers. Pages of breakdowns covered a long table like shingles. Scenes, timings, cues, costs. On the wall, a calendar marched forward with a soldier's certainty. The first human face drawn for the long story looked back at its makers as if asking whether it could trust them. "Eyes are the door," said Grimm, studying the sketch. "If the door is wrong, the house falls." Young animators learned to find the weight in a human step, the slip in a startled glance, the way a smile is not just a shape, but a decision. In the ink and paint rooms, powders and liquids turned into colors with names like lullaby and lightning. A woman named Grace mixed a blue so clean it felt like air. "It'll make the snow colder," she promised, and everyone believed her. At home, Lillian kept a steady hearth. Walt brought the day with him like sawdust on a coat. He would tell her the best moments. A reel that finally sang, a scene that surprised its makers, the single note a clarinet found that opened a door, and hold back the worst until they sat shoulder to shoulder and the house light rested on the back of their hands. "How close are we?" she'd ask. "Close enough that the distance hurts," he'd say. They ate simple meals and traded silence like a blanket. Sometimes she would press a sandwich into his palm as he left again, the bread still warm, and he would feel, for one long second, completely safe. The world pressed back in the usual ways. A rumor leaped fences. Disney was making a picture far longer than sanity allowed, a folly that would drown the studio in debt and leave the mouse whistling alone on a pier. Rivals sneered in public and stole tricks in private. Newspapers, when they knew it all, used words like audacious and ill-advised, sometimes in the same paragraph, as if language itself could not choose whether to clap or scold. In the hallways, crew wore their courage like sleeves, visible, easily stained, often rolled up higher. Roy kept the numbers disciplined and the voices gentle. He took long walks after midnight and returned with sums that just held. The multiplane camera took shape in a room that smelled like metal and solvable problems. Plates of glass stacked like a vertical world. Lights warmed like dawn, On it, forest deepened, candles glowed farther back, and the space between a character and her fate felt measurable. The first test made people gasp before they remembered to praise. A young artist cried a little in the dark, not for sadness, but for the sudden dizzy sense of having stood at a door and finally seen it open. "We can go in," she whispered. "We can actually go inside." Pressure found every seam. One afternoon, an entire sequence collapsed under its own cleverness. It was jokey where it needed truth, noisy where it needed breath. Walt screened it for the crew, let silence sit, then stood up with the tired calm of a man sweated thin. "We laughed without love," he said, drawing a line through 12 feet of work. "Let's love first." No one argued. They sharpened pencils as if sharpening vows. The next version, quieter, patient with small wonder, felt like a hand placed gently on a heartbeat. Illness threaded through days, as it does whenever the body chases work too far. A cough here, a fever there, a week lost, a role reshuffled so a deadline wouldn't drown. Walt himself learned the curve of a headache that refused advice. He went home once, sat in the dark, and counted the seconds between pain. Lillian stood beside him and counted breaths instead. "You are allowed to stop," she said. He shook his head without pride, just with the stubborn knowledge that the story would not finish itself. He slept a little and returned, looking older by a week and younger by a purpose that refused to leave. Bits of life kept sneaking into the film without asking. The way a cloak falls when fear loosens. The way a bird's head tilts when it thinks you might be kind. The way grief enters a room and stands near the window because it needs light to go on. Animators told on themselves, their nervous jokes, their secret hopes, their mother's hands teaching them patience, their father's quiet disappointments. The studio stopped being only a factory and became a mirror that did not lie, even when everyone wished it would. "If we tell it true," Walt reminded them, "they will forgive the tricks." He believed people could feel honesty even when hidden behind paint and music. He was betting everything on that belief. Money ran downhill as if water meant to leave. Paydays were met, late once, nearly missed twice. Roy found new bankers by talking to old friends. He mortgaged pieces of the future like a man selling rooms he planned to build. Walt mortgaged himself. His house, his name, the trust he'd piled up one laugh at a time. He walked into offices carrying the same suitcase he had carried years before, only now it held reels instead of hunger. "Look," he would say, and a chair would be dragged to a small projector, and a man who had come prepared to say no would watch a girl look out a window while leaves turned to music. Some said no anyway. Some said yes, blinking as if they'd been hit by a soft, slow wave and found themselves standing ankle-deep in a feeling they had not planned to have. The crew learned to measure life by reels and rough cuts. Babies were born, parents were buried. Marriages began in courtyards lit by string lights the color of warm mercury. The film absorbed it all, converted each sigh and laughter into choices a character would make when the hour demanded it. The day a dancer visited to model a movement for the heroine, the room fell quiet. She stepped, paused, turned her head as if listening to a small animal, and in that gentle arc, an entire childhood settled on the paper. "There," Walt said. "Hold that truth." They tried. The pencil trembled and obeyed. People outside began to call the project by a nickname with teeth. Disney's Folly. Inside, the joke lost power. They reclaimed it, wore it like a badge, a dare pinned to a shirt. "How's the folly?" a delivery man teased. "Learning to speak," someone answered. "Learning to sing," added another. "Learning to make rent," Roy corrected. But even he smiled as he said it. Near the end, when the finishing line looked like a shore seen across fog and the last miles cost double, a late-night screening closed the staff into the small theatre like monks at vigil. The picture was rough in places, a marvel in others. A scene landed so true that even the hardened laughed, as if their ribs had doors that flew open. Then came the part that asked for tears. It received them. Not manipulated ones, not the cheap kind, tears that surprised the faces they visited. The lights came up and no one spoke for a count of 10. "It works," Ub said softly, as if reporting a heartbeat. Walt nodded, and didn't trust himself to say more. He went home through streets that breathed a different hour. A bakery set out tomorrow's bread. A stray dog trotted with purpose and no clear destination. He unlocked his door and set the keys down with the care of a man returning something borrowed. Lillian woke enough to see his face in the kitchen light. "Well?" she asked. He took her hand and for once allowed the simple sentence, "It's going to be all right." But all right still required a final leap. The last loans had to be signed. The orchestra needed to be paid and fed. The lab time was booked in blocks that could not be moved without losing days they did not have. Invitations had been printed, and a premiere date hovered on the calendar like weather you can't postpone. A final rumor said the whole city would come to witness a miracle or a public drowning. The staff slept in shifts for a week, dreams filled with dancing cups and the color of winter. On a grey morning, Walt stood in the banker's office again. The man's pen waited above the line like a gull over water. Roy's jaw worked as if chewing air. The city below looked calm in a way that felt like a lie. "This is everything," the banker said, half warning, half admiration. Walt felt the room tilt and right itself. He thought of the garage, the mouse, the first whistle, the hand lifting a pot lid in time with music, the faces in the dark when laughter found them, the tears that had not been invited but had come anyway because truth had called. He took the pen. For a second, the metal felt cold as snow. The night before he signed the last sheet, he laid the pen down, listened to the kitchen clock ticking like a small hammer far away, and whispered, "All right then." The ink shone in his mind like a narrow river that had to be crossed before the sun rose. On the line outside the banker's door, hope and risk stood shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air. In the next room, an orchestra waited to tune. The premiere unfurled like a flag no one was sure would fly. The Carthay Circle Theatre glowed against the December dark, its tower a pale candle, its marquee a dare. Cars slid to the curb and opened like treasure chests, executives in sharp coats, actresses with shoulders that caught the light, working people in their best Sunday, children stiff with excitement and sugar. Flashbulbs cracked like small storms. A newsboy outside chanted headlines that had not yet been printed. "They say it's a cartoon," a man scoffed to his date. "They say it's a picture," she answered, and picked the truth she wanted. Inside, velvet ate sound. The air held perfume and popcorn, cologne and hope. Walt stood at the back, where leaders stand when they are brave enough to listen. Roy took a place near the aisle, where numbers could find him if they needed to. Lillian touched Walt's sleeve once, a silent promise that if the room turned cold, she would still be warm. The orchestra tuned with the pinpoint anxiety of surgeons. The lights dimmed so slowly that the audience felt not darkness, but being carried. A hush turned the theatre into a single lung. The book opened on the screen, the first page of the fairy tale. Gilt edges, winking like coins. A voice read as if offering bread. A girl sang clear as frost at sunrise. Her face, alive, not made, tender, not cheap, turned toward a well, and the well threw her song back to her with perfect faith. People leaned forward as if pulled by thread. In the darkness, a veteran producer who had come to gloat felt his mouth soften into a smile he did not authorize. A boy in the balcony whispered, "She's real," and did not mean the actress. He meant the feeling. When the forest frightened her, the theatre winced. Branches lunged, shadows shattered into eyes. Fear turned shapes into monsters, then back into wood when truth breathed on them. A little girl reached for her mother's hand. On a far row, a hard critic wrote 2 words he had not expected to ever write about animation. "It hurts." Then, joy as bright as soap bubbles. Dwarfs arguing and harmonizing. A house made of labor and laughter. Grumpy tried not to care and cared anyway. Doc fumbled and led anyway. Dopey learned with his whole face. Somewhere, a young animator who had drawn Dopey's feet held her breath and heard the room laugh where she had hoped they would. A cellist in the pit wiped his eye and played the next bar steady. Then the deep winter inside the story. A sleeping stillness so complete that the audience breathed as if not to disturb it. The kiss, simple, unadorned, a bell struck clean. The audience lifted, a tide moved by the moon. The ending arrived like dawn, not like a trick. The lights returned as if apologizing for being late. For a long second that felt like a held heart, no one moved. Then the sound. Applause exploded and rolled. Whistles laced it. Feet pounded. People stood without remembering to stand. Strangers hugged and then laughed at holding a stranger. A stagehand backstage said later, "It felt like a building learning to sing." Walt did not bow. He stayed in the dim, catching the echo's shape. He felt relief land and immediately break into smaller birds. Payroll, lab fees, rent, promises he'd made to men who would now expect them kept in full and on time. Roy's grin had numbers in it, all of them finally walking uphill instead of down. Outside, cameras found them. "Mr. Disney," a reporter called. "What do you call this? What you've done?" Walt's answer rode the edge between honest and brave. "A good start," he said. In the weeks that followed, theatres filled and refilled. Newspapers reached for new compliments and sometimes grabbed truth on the way. A revelation. A triumph. A new instrument. Money, that skeptical friend, arrived in bundles that looked like forgiveness. Roy paid debts as if burying weather. He opened accounts that had been closed to men with dreams and gave back smiles to clerks who had learned to say no. He ordered new desks and more chairs and, with a sigh that sounded like an answered prayer, raised salaries where they needed raising. "We're steady," he told Lillian. She squeezed his hand so he'd know what that word had cost. Inside the studio, the air changed flavour. Laughter grew richer. The cafeteria line hummed with rumours of the next thing. Young artists who had watched the feature from the back row moved their pencils with a new courage. Old hands, proud and wary, protected standards they had almost died building. The multiplane camera purred, now not a bet but a tool. A composer whistled a theme and felt at once the weight of success and the lift of having so much more to score. But triumph is a shy tenant. It brings company, expectation, scrutiny, the whisper that says, "Do it again, bigger." Invitation letters thickened on the mailroom table. Projects, partnerships, pictures, products. Contracts curled like ribbons, clauses multiplied like rabbits. Lawyers learned the taste of the studio coffee. Bankers who once had smirked now smiled too often. Rivals sharpened knives but also took notes. He aimed at the heart, one confessed in a bar. Missed nothing. At home, quiet shifted too. Walt found it harder to put the day down at the door. Exhaustion stalked the corners. A new house, bought with old worry, held the footsteps of new pressure. Sometimes he paced the hall with an invisible pencil, rewriting scenes that no longer needed him. Lillian would sit him on the porch steps and hand him a glass of water as if he were a field hand come in from heat. "Look," she'd say. The garden answered with simple facts. Tomatoes reddening, a cat deciding to trust. The moon rehearsing. "All right," he'd say, the word doing more work than it looked built for. Snow White kept filling seats. The studio filled with plans. Men with clipboards walked the lot, measuring not only rooms but faith. The staff split into crews for shorts to feed the present, and crews for new features to court the future. Pinocchio flickered on storyboards, his nose a moral metronome. A whale opened a throat like a cathedral. A cricket practiced sentences that sounded like conscience. On another wall, a flying boy refused to grow up. On yet another, elephants with ears like sails dreamed of lifting off the ground. The building rang with the hammer of beginnings, and yet beneath the applause, a smaller percussion. The tick of a clock that had started the moment the cheering began. Success had purchased not rest but leverage, and leverage leans both ways. Production costs rose like bread left too long near the oven. The world outside quivered. Labour asking for fairness. Markets testing sunlight. Storms forming that no one on the lot could stop. In the ink and paint rooms, voices, mostly women's, compared wages with careful math and careful courage. On the boards, schedules stretched, then snapped. Roy's pen found a new groove between generous and safe. More than once, Walt stared at a budget and saw the shape of a dream arguing with the shape of a week. One late evening, the lot empty but for a single stage light and the cat that patrolled like a small, furry sheriff, Walt stood by the fence and watched traffic beyond the hedges. The city's breath blew over the roofline. Cars, laughter, music from a radio half a block away, playing a tune they did not own. He could feel the next cliff under his shoes, and he did not fear it. He only minded the height. Somewhere inside, a young employee placed a union leaflet in a pocket. Somewhere else, a contractor pitched an idea that had nothing to do with cells or reels. Land, gates, a park where joy could be walked through like weather you chose. He closed his eyes and saw two futures at once. One made of film canisters stacked like gold coins. The other made of pathways and parades, of brass and wood and smiles that needed tickets. The first was safer and already hard. The second was a map in smoke, a whisper with price tags, a dare that felt like the first time he had said feature out loud. He opened his eyes to the night. The studio exhaled behind him, pleased and tired. The city inhaled ahead, hungry and loud. In the space between those breaths, something like a vow formed. Not words yet, just pressure in the chest that pushes a life toward its next shape. The empire of imagination was awake now, And empires do not sleep long. The clock did what clocks do. It started to count toward the next risk. Night folded itself neatly over the lot, but inside, plans refused to sleep. On one wall, a boy of wood ran toward the light. On another, a sorcerer's hat tilted like a dare. On a third, a deer lifted its head as if hearing a violin where the rest of the world heard only wind. The mouse, dependable as morning, kept the books honest, bringing in steady joy while the new stories built their lungs. Walt stood between boards like a man on a dock with ships leaving in every direction. Music itself as the star, he murmured about one project, tracing circles in air where notes would drift. A whale so large you can feel the water. His hands drew the curves. His eyes did the math he pretended not to see. Roy did the rest of the math. His penciled columns grew taller, then thinner, as if altitude could change reality. Costs rose like a tide. Sound demanded new gear. Color demanded more hands. Realism demanded time, the most expensive tool of all. We'll need to pace ourselves, he said. We'll need to ask again, Walt answered, meaning bankers, meaning grace. The brothers shared a look that carried the years between paper routes and premieres, between soup and champagne. They were both right. They were both tired. Neither was finished. In the paint rooms, women weighed pigments with scales that clicked like delicate clocks. They talked quietly about rent and the new car someone's cousin bought and a pamphlet that had surfaced. Near the gate, words like rights and dues printed in a font that seemed too stern. For a place that made laughter, a few tucked the paper away. A few threw it out. A few read and folded it carefully as if it were a recipe worth trying. Inking lines, they steadied the future by microns. Across the street, a radio at a gas station mumbled other news. Borders crossed, treaties bent, clouds thickening over oceans. Europe, a market that had embraced the little mouse and the girl with the song, shifted its weight in a way that made ledgers feel the tremor. If those doors close, Roy warned gently one afternoon, we'll be dancing on one foot. Walt heard him and stared longer at the boards, as if will alone could weatherproof the art. There was a day, ordinary on the calendar, that grew teeth before lunch, a sequence screen too long and too dear. A composer defended a cue that did not defend itself. Two animators, good men, good friends, found their tempers hooked to the same nail. Walt stepped between them, took one by the shoulder and one by the elbow, and walked them outside. Breathe, he said, because sometimes leadership is only a reminder that oxygen is free. We're not arguing about pride, he added softly. We're arguing about the best way to keep a promise we made to a room full of people who trusted us. The men nodded, embarrassed, a little saved. Inside, the reel found 4 frames to lose and 1 grace note to gain. Visitors still came, wide-eyed children, narrower-eyed businessmen, journalists with pencils sharpened like spears. A reporter asked a question that had been waiting in the wings since the applause at Carthay Circle. Is this all about fantasy? Walt considered, the word hovering like a moth. It's about making the world a little kinder for 90 minutes, he said. If that's fantasy, I hope it's contagious. The journalist's pencil relaxed. A quote was born that would be printed in black and white and remembered in color. Yet real life kept knocking with those heavy knuckles it prefers. A machinist's child fell ill. A color supervisor lost a parent far away and could not afford the train. Paychecks came, but sometimes late enough to make courage blink. Rumors penciled themselves in margins, of unions, of cuts, of a wall you could not see but could feel when you pressed your palm flat against the air. Roy listened, asked questions, adjusted where he could. He had the face of a man trying to make a table bigger without cutting more wood. Walt spoke to the crew, not from height but from the middle of the room, and told them what they already knew. We're trying to build 3 bridges at once. We'll cross them if we keep walking. Nights carried new experiments. In a darkened stage, engineers strung cables and planted speakers like saplings, testing a sound that moved through space like weather. Music that could roll past an audience, whisper at the ears and vanish behind them with a grin. Fantasound, someone named it, half in pride, half in disbelief. The test worked. The bill arrived. The bill did not smile. It's the future, Walt said. Roy sighed, the old soldier in him understanding both the thrill of new tools and the cost of carrying them over the hill. On weekends, Walt drove. Orange groves gave way to patchwork fields, dusty lots, a creek that pretended to be a river. He stopped sometimes and watched families at picnic tables with splinters, Kids chasing a kite that wouldn't obey wind, parents who looked around and wished the world would meet them halfway in joy. He sketched on a scrap. An entrance like a smile, streets as clean as promises, a boat ride where the story strolled beside you and tipped its hat. He put the sketch in his pocket the way people put away a note to themselves. Later, when the storm passes, when the house is fixed, when there's time. Back at the studio, time was a bell no one could ignore. The next feature wobbled upright, dizzy with cost and beauty. Another followed with music for bones. The deer refined its steps until grass itself seemed to nod. The mouse kept knitting Fridays to Fridays. Letters arrived from Europe, fewer now, full of love and apology, stamped in ink that smelled like distance. "We'll come back," one theatre owner promised. Roy held the paper longer than he needed to and whispered, "Please do." The morning the call came, the sun was doing a perfect impression of a faithful friend. Walt was in story, sleeves up. Roy was at his desk building a tiny bridge out of numbers. The receptionist's voice cracked the hallway calm. "Mr. Roy, it's First National," he picked up. Walt watched his brother's face turn into a map. You could see the rivers of worry, the towns of thought, the unmarked place where a decision would have to build a road. He hung up and found Walt in the doorway before Walt could ask. "They'll extend," Roy said, and the air loosened an inch. "But they want terms that pull tomorrow into today." He handed over a paper full of clauses that believed in gravity more than grace. Walt read, jaw set. He looked past the door, where the sorcerer's hat tilted over magic that hadn't yet learned its price tag, where a wooden boy promised truth in a voice that would cost extra microphones, where a deer stood very still, sensing a wind that wasn't weather. He set the paper down. "We can do it," he said, not fearless, but stubborn in the honest way of men who have once outrun their own doubt. "We'll pay for wonder with work." Roy nodded. "We always have." Somewhere outside the fence, a radio spoke of ships at sea. Somewhere inside, a single violin tested a phrase that might hold a picture together. On Walt's desk lay the Orange Grove sketch he hadn't meant to leave out. A gate drawn like a greeting, a street that led to a world. He slid it under a ledger, as if tucking a dream into a drawer where bills were kept, then looked up at his brother. "We'll need credit," Roy said. "We'll need courage," Walt answered. In the hall, the phone began to ring again, steady as a metronome. Roy stepped toward it. Walt stood still, listening to both futures at once, the one inside reels, the one that smelled like grass after sprinklers, and heard them rhyme in a way that felt like fate borrowing the voice of a banker. The receiver lifted. A deal waited. The next risk leaned closer. The pen hovered above the line like a bird that had learned hesitation. Roy read the clauses again, lips moving without sound. Numbers are a language best spoken silently. In the hallway, footsteps passed, quick, purposeful, the sound of a company that had learned to keep its own pulse. Walt turned the paper so the light fell clean across it, as if clarity could be coaxed by brightness alone. "If we sign," Roy said, voice even, "we own the chance and the chain both." He didn't have to finish. If they didn't, the chance walked away, and the chain came anyway. Another kind, the kind that wrapped empty rooms and quiet phones. He signed. Then Walt signed. The nib scratched like a match struck in a cave. The banker smiled the way a man smiles at a bridge he is not the one to cross. Back on the lot, the signature rippled outward in quiet shocks. Ink turned to hours. Hours turned to scenes. Scenes to reels that would soon need an orchestra and a room dark enough to measure breath. People were called in from errands. Pay packets thickened a little, thin still but hopeful. On the bulletin board, a new schedule appeared, pinned by 4 tacks, whose heads shone like stars if you were tired enough to mistake them. The work surged forward, with a complicated joy. The wooden boy learned to be almost human, a trick more dangerous than any the mouse had ever tried, because almost is a cliff. The sorcerer's apprentice summoned brooms that obeyed too well. In the soundstage next door, engineers taught speakers to travel like ghosts along the walls, a magic both pure and ruinously expensive. A deer's mother bent her head, and the room that watched her drew breath in a single involuntary chord that would become part of the score whether the composer wrote it or not. "Careful," Walt said softly to the animators, not as a warning, but as an asking. "Hold them without pushing." Outside the gates, headlines carried another kind of hold, the world grasping at itself. Borders hardened, ships moved like intent. A market went dim, then dark. Roy drew new maps on old ledgers. the way men draw detours after the river takes the road. The staff felt the weather change in their pay, in the way the boss's voices lowered at doorways, in the way confidence now required more scaffolding and fewer witnesses. Still, the dailies glowed, the rushes glimmered. In the small theatre, the rough cuts stitched and unstitched a kind of truth that made the lamp on the projector look like a candle in a chapel. "It's worth it," someone whispered, not sure whether they meant the picture or the price. At home, the porch steps held the day's weight. Lillian poured coffee that cooled too fast and watched her husband measure distances no ruler could mark. He spoke of strings and storms, of a cricket who could teach a boy the grammar of a promise, of a forest where snow fell in silence thick as wool. He did not speak of unions, though the word sat between sentences like a guest at the edge of a chair. He did not speak of the park sketch, though the paper in his pocket warmed with every thought he didn't say. One thing at a time, he told himself. The lie was loving, the truth impatient. In the studio cafeteria, forks clicked like distant typewriters. A leaflet changed hands, then changed pockets. A debate flared, careful and hot. What was owed? What was fair? What could be afforded without breaking the spell that paid for everything? "We've built this together," a painter argued, streak of cobalt on her thumb like a flag. "We'll lose it together if we pull too hard," a timing chart man replied, not unkind. Between them stood a silenced hat was not empty, an inventory of trust, long hours, promises made and met and missed, and the stubborn fact that art and payroll drink from the same well. Walt gathered the crew in the screening room. The screen blank, the seats full, the air the temperature of attention. He did not speak from the aisle. He stepped among them and let his voice travel the short, honest way. "We are not a miracle factory," he said, "but we do chase miracles for a living." A laugh, grateful to be invited. "We've got more picture than money today, and I'm not proud of that. I'm proud of you. We'll make it right, and we'll make it better. I can't ask you to believe the bank. I can only ask you to watch this next reel and tell me if we're still keeping our promise to the audience." The lights dimmed. The reel played. When it ended, no one clapped. They just sat, held, and then breathed together, which is another kind of endorsement. Spring came disguised as ordinary days. The violins finished their sentences. The press releases went out. The posters glowed from windows. The features took their turns in the world and found, each in their way, what the world would give back. Wonder, yes. Money, sometimes. Questions always. Fantasia dazzled and frightened the ledger. Pinocchio sailed and sank and sailed again on waves of praise and cost. Bambi took its time, and in taking time, learned what time takes. Meanwhile, the mouse, loyal craftsman, modest star, kept the doors from sticking. Between features, Mickey winked from screens like a reliable uncle who knows a town's weather. He allowed the studio to breathe between dives. He allowed Roy to add, however cautiously, without subtracting hope. And yet, the hush before a new storm had settled. You could hear it in the way the lot's cat paused at corners, in the way the night guard rattled the gate twice instead of once, in the way Walt touched the railing at the top of the stairs as if testing the building's pulse. The union talk thickened. A letter arrived that did not say please. Another arrived that did not say thank you. Meetings were called where words turned into stones, and then, with care or luck, back into words. One evening, Walt stayed late alone, a pencil rolling back and forth on his desk with the breath of the building. He took out the Orange Grove sketch and set it beside a ledger column that refused to behave. The two pieces of paper looked at each other like old cousins who had avoided meeting for years. He could smell cut grass that didn't exist yet, hear a calliope that hadn't been built, feel the relief of parents who needed a place designed for their patience as much as their children's joy. He folded the page again, smaller, as if secrecy could make it grow stronger. He walked the empty hallway, past doors that held projects like weather in rooms. In one, a broom still leaned as if waiting for orders. In another, a painted fawn stared at a painted dawn. In another, the mouse sat, grin steady, eyes bright, the original conspirator of joy. "You started this," Walt told him softly, and the mouse, properly drawn, agreed without arrogance. Near the exit, a bulletin flapped. Thumbtack loose, the meeting to come, the vote to take, the line that would be crossed one way or the other. He pressed the tack down with his thumb until the paper stopped trembling. In the parking lot, the night smelled like hot metal cooling, citrus far off, ocean farther. The city's neon hummed and blinked, a tired lighthouse for whoever needed it. He looked back at the dark windows of his studio and saw in them his own reflection, multiplied, thinned, stubborn. Behind that mirror, a family name had become a company, and a company had become a crowded table. Artists, engineers, bookkeepers, dreamers, people who wash brushes and people who wash cups, all of them owed and owing, all of them waiting. He unlocked his car, slid behind the wheel, and sat without starting the engine. The next chapter, of credit extended, of clocks that sentence and save, of a park that would demand land and faith, pressed against the inside of his ribs, like a letter he had not yet mailed. He turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, and purred with the exact kind of optimism he needed. Down the block, the banker's office kept its own late hours. Across town, a union hall stacked chairs for a meeting that had already happened in 100 quiet conversations. On his passenger seat, a folded sketch waited with the patience of a seed. He pulled into the street. He drove without the radio, letting the city's noises stack into a kind of score. Bus brakes sighing like tired lungs. A couple arguing softly on a porch and then laughing. A siren far off becoming only a thread of urgency pulled loose by distance. Traffic lights rinsed his windshield green, then red, then green again, as if blessing, then warning, then blessing once more. He turned onto a side street where trees remembered a time before the houses, and for a minute the world felt like pencil on paper again. Simple lines, bold decisions, a horizon you could invent. At a stop sign, he glanced toward a schoolyard, the fence locked, swings hanging still, the soft creak of a chain in the breeze sounding almost like a child's half-remembered song. He imagined a place where those swings would never sound lonely, where a bell would ring not to dismiss children, but to call them into wonder, where the ground would be clean enough for parents to let their guard down, where even the trash cans would look like they meant it. A vague map brightened behind his eyes. A street that led to smaller streets that led to stories. A boat gliding into a cave of stars. A locomotive not built to arrive fast, but to arrive smiling. The light changed. The map folded. He drove on. At home, the door's latch clicked like a period to a very long sentence. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper. Lillian's books, his scripts, 1,000 lists. He stood in the kitchen where the floor still held the footprints of last year's Christmas. The clock over the stove kept its modest beat. On the table lay mail, 2 bills leaning together like conspirators, a postcard from an exhibitor back east with a coffee stain in one corner, and a letter with careful handwriting that turned out to belong to a child in Nebraska. The child had seen the wooden boy nearly tell the truth and had decided to try it himself. "I did not break the window," the letter promised, "but I would have told you if I had." Walt smiled in spite of the day. He put the letter on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a horseshoe, the lucky kind that only works if you believe in both luck and horses. Sleep came like an understudy, late but ready, and left too early. Dawn returned with its usual plain offer, light if you'll use it. He shaved, the mirror a truthful and not unkind friend. In that silver rectangle, he could see a boy with ink on his fingers and a man with signatures on his name. Buddies behind him and bankers ahead. He tugged his tie knot twice the way he always did when going to ask the world for something it wouldn't give freely. Lillian watched from the doorway, one hand on the frame as if steadying the room for both of them. "You'll build what you see," she said. He kissed her cheek and felt courage return from its coffee break. At the studio gate, the guard tipped his cap and the cat made its morning rounds with the authority of a senior editor. The lot woke like a town, stages opening their eyes, doors yawning, technicians talking in low voices about wires and wattage and why a hum wouldn't stop humming. In ink and paint, lamps came on in a line like little suns discovering they had neighbors. Brushes touched water. Pigments sighed into purpose. In the animation building, paper stacks squared themselves under palms. Pencils sharpened. 100 wrists rolled in invisible circles to warm the engine no one had ever named but everyone drove. A notice on the board carried fresh staples and old nerves. Meeting at lunch. Questions about hours. Questions about credit for work. Questions about the way applause outside took its time turning into relief inside. The words had been chosen by someone who knew how to keep a fuse from catching. But the fuse was there anyway, lying along the baseboard, daring a spark. Walt ran his thumb along the edge of the notice and felt the truth in it graze his skin. These people were not merely instruments. They were a choir, and choirs do not sing well for conductors who won't hear them. He walked through the camera room where the multiplane tower gleamed like a complicated promise. A crew adjusted glass panes and spoke to each other in the shorthand of practiced grace. Down 2. Light at 30. No, 28. Hold that shadow. He paused at a test cell of the deer in a forest where winter's breath turned the air to lace. The animal's eye, mixed the day before by Grace with her bottle of clean blue and her certainty, held a depth that made him swallow. "We'll need more time on that sequence," he told the lead. The lead nodded, grateful and frightened in the same heartbeat. Time was money, and money was a hallway with more doors than exits. Roy's office door stood ajar the way a brother's door does when he expects you, welcomes you, and needs to finish a line of numbers before he looks up. Walt leaned in. Roy didn't glance away from the page. "How bad?" Walt asked. Roy made the sound of a man sorting marbles in the dark. "Bad enough to make good men disagree." He turned the ledger around. The columns were towers with ladders missing. "We can make the week," he said. "We can make the month if we sell a corner of the year." He tapped the margin where the corner lived. "Fantasound is a prince who eats like a regiment, oversees as rain on a day I promise sunshine. And the folks out there," he tilted his head toward the window, "have needs that are not imaginary." Walt took it in, all of it, the way you take in air before a dive. "We'll meet at lunch," he said. "We'll listen more than we talk." Roy raised an eyebrow. "You?" Walt grinned without humor. "I'll try." Morning ran. Scenes came off the pegs and joined their future. In the scoring stage, a bassoon found a sorrow that fit the wooden boy like a coat, and in the mixing booth, a young engineer grinned when a sound slipped along the room and came back behind him like a friend playing a trick. In the carpentry shop, a set of risers grew, smelling of cut pine and persistence. In the parking lot, a man in a suit no one recognized balanced a briefcase on his knees and read through a stack of papers with interest that might turn into power. The cat leapt into noon's shadow and disappeared. Lunch arrived with the weather of decision. Folding chairs scraped, sandwiches unwrapped into a chorus of wax paper size. Walt stood, not on a stage but on the floor, where he could feel the heat of the crowd the way you feel a fire's honesty. He cleared his throat and let the first sentence be ordinary. "Thank you for the morning." The room softened an inch. He told them what they already knew, and what he hadn't wanted to admit, that the work had outgrown the way they paid for it, that the industry beyond their fence was learning to measure an animator's worth with new rulers, that he and Roy had made mistakes and would make fewer if they were told about them sooner, not later. He did not say the word union. He respected it in its taut silence. Others did say it, calmly, with faces that had learned to be brave without becoming cruel. The conversation didn't solve the day, but it kept the house standing. That, sometimes, is the exact definition of victory. When it ended, he slipped away to the small projection room where he first told the word feature to empty chairs. He sat in the same seat, and this time he didn't imagine a book opening. He imagined a gate. Not of iron, but of invitation. He imagined a street that began with where you were and ended with who you remembered being at your best. He imagined his family name above it, not like a crown, but like a lantern, both light and responsibility. The room was quiet enough to hear his own blood think. The door opened without knocking. Roy stepped in, closed it behind him, leaned against it the way men do when the world refuses to lean anywhere else. "They'll vote," he said. Walt nodded. "We'll accept it." Roy studied his face for the tantrum that did not come and seemed for a second surprised. "What?" Walt asked, half amused. "You're growing up," Roy said. "Happens to the best of us." They stood there, two boys from a cold kitchen, two men from a hot town, two brothers with a ledger between them and a mouse that refused to stop smiling. Roy broke the silence with the only fact that mattered. "We're short by Friday." Walt smiled a tired smile. "Then we'll sell a little more of the future to get there." He reached into his pocket, and the park sketch, forgotten, folded, stubborn, touched his hand like a pulse. By twilight, the lot glowed as if someone had hung the moon on a dimmer and turned it to possible. Cars rolled out through the gate one by one. A woman in paint washed her brushes until the water ran honest again. An animator tacked a photograph of his newborn above his desk, and on impulse, drew the child's laugh as 4 simple lines. A machinist wiped his hands and checked his watch. and smiled at the thought of a fence he had promised to fix this weekend. Ordinary life, this quiet, loud miracle, swept in, carried them toward their kitchens and their porches and their small, courageous beds. Walt lingered. He walked once more to the fence where, if he squinted, he could see the road that ran past the orange grove he'd loved to drive. In his mind, the grove turned to streets, the streets to stories, the stories to a country you could visit without a passport. He could already hear the brass, patient and bright. He could already smell popcorn that didn't know it would become a symbol. He could already feel the weight of a key on his palm. The key that opens a gate and a question in the same turn. A car horn sounded at the curb. Roy, waiting, the clock in his head as exact as ever. Walt exhaled and smiled as if he were finally answering a dare he'd written to himself years ago. He turned toward the parking lot, and just then, the phone inside the small administration office began to ring. One ring, two, three, not frantic, not casual. The sound punctured the evening like a dot of light through canvas. He paused, listening. It kept ringing. On the other end, a banker, or a lawyer, or a union man, or a city official with a question about land. Any of them could change the shape of tomorrow with a sentence. The phone rang again. He took one step toward the door. He crossed the threshold, and the building's night breath met him. Paper, wood, a last thin coil of solder smell from the machine shop. The phone rang on the little metal desk, steady as a heartbeat that refused to hurry. He lifted the receiver, and the cord made a soft, serpentine sound. "Disney," he said, voice leveled by miles of trying. For a second, only the hush of distance. Then a man's tone, polished to a shine by offices and learning to say yes for a fee. "Mr. Disney, I think we can help," the voice said, and the word help carried small teeth. "If you're willing to be imaginative." Papers rustled on the other end, like dry leaves deciding whether to burn. Through the window, Roy's car idled, a patient metronome of exhaust. In the dark hall beyond, the staff's lunch chairs sat folded like wings. The receiver warmed against his palm. "Imaginative," Walt repeated, and the room seemed to tilt toward a cliff it already knew. The voice named numbers, then conditions, then time. It offered a hand that felt as steady as a ledge. He closed his eyes and saw the mouse whistling, the girl singing to a well, the wooden boy learning the grammar of truth, the deer's blue eye, the multiplane's glass plates stacked like a staircase into depth. He saw, too, a gate drawn in a pocket sketch, lanterns lit, brass ready, a street beginning in the ordinary and walking without hurry into wonder. He opened his eyes. "Tell me," he said, not because he was ready, but because readiness and destiny often wear the same coat when the hour is late. Outside, the guard locked the front gate with a double click. Far off, a train moaned, hauling night across the valley. The banker's voice lowered to the place where deals change a family's future. "Here are the terms." The pencil on the desk rolled once, then stopped. Point toward the line he would soon be asked to sign. He let the man talk. Let the numbers build their staircase. Let each condition try to lay claim to the future like a fence post hammered into soft ground. There would be liens on prints, participation clips, a clause that turned a miss into a mortgage, a schedule that carved weeks into thinner slices than air. "It's not charity, Mr. Disney," the voice said, smooth as a polished banister. "It's belief, in installments." Walt watched the pencil on the desk as if it were a weather vane. When the man paused, he heard the small sounds that make up a life. The click of the wall clock, the soft tap of a loose shade against the window, the thrum of Roy's engine keeping time outside like loyalty does. "Let me be plain," Walt answered. "If I take this, I'll use every last drop of it not to float but to build. So the next time we meet, you're not lending air, you're buying a ticket. On the other end, a quiet that meant respect or calculation. Perhaps both. In the balance, it did not matter. "We're agreed," the banker said at last. "Come in the morning. Bring your brother." He hung up, and the room exhaled. For a moment, he left his hand resting on the receiver, as if it were a shoulder. Then he set it down, and stood still in the sort of silence people confuse with peace, but which is really decision cooling to hardness. He stepped into the hallway. The building gave back a faint echo of footsteps, old ghosts of days, when they had been fewer, hungrier, freer, in a way that could never return and shouldn't. It had been freedom with teeth. Through the window he saw Roy watching the door. Walt raised a hand. 2 fingers. like a boy signaling a play in the dust of a summer diamond. Roy nodded and cut the engine. In the car, the night felt larger but less cruel. Terms? Roy asked. Terms, Walt confirmed. Possible, Roy guessed, and the word held both burden and breath. Possible, Walt said, and smiled the way men smile when the rope still holds and they're a third of the way across. They drove home without music. The tires wrote their own notes on the road. From a porch somewhere, a radio poured a ballad into the dark. A dog barked twice, then remembered that contentment is cheaper than alarm. At a red light, Walt glanced down at his pocket. The folded sketch pressed back. Quiet, stubborn, alive. Morning came like facts. Coffee, shirt sleeves, the clean snap of a ledger closing. Roy checked his hat in the mirror with the motion of a soldier who never leaves anything behind that he can carry forward. We'll fight for better on the edges, he said, meaning clauses, penalties, punctual mercy. Walt nodded, and without thinking, kissed Lillian's knuckles on his way out the door, as if luck could be tethered by courtesy. The city lifted its blinds. Streetcars clanged. They parked a block from the bank, because a habit of walking clears the mind where interest rates do not. Inside, the carpet made their steps polite. The banker rose, all handshakes and assurances that had learned to dress themselves as friendship. Gentlemen, he said, and the word gentleman carried witnesses, every maker who had come in poor and left proud or broke. Papers were laid out with the gravity of hymnals. Roy read, and when he reached the far edge of a sentence, Walt could see his brother pause and make a small, invisible tally of cost against breath. They asked for 2 changes and received 1. They asked for 1 kindness and were offered a smile that was not a kindness. They signed. The pens moved like skates across black ice that did not crack. When they stepped back onto the sidewalk, the light seemed too honest for the trick they had just pulled on doubt. The city was ordinary again. A newsboy listing a morning's catastrophes, a woman laughing into a scarf. The scent of bread from a bakery that would never know its schedule had been saved by a cartoon deer and a marching broom. Back to work, Roy said, not as an order but as relief's only decent answer. Back to work, Walt echoed, and the words tasted like bread and iron and the edge of a promise. The studio answered with motion. In the scoring stage, a kettle drum tested a storm. In ink and paint, a tray of colours slid along a table like sunrise being portioned out. In the camera room, the multiplane breathed its soft animal breath, and glass floated up, down, and up again in a choreography that could make you believe gravity was another negotiable clause. Walt stood at the doorway and watched work rescue the day from theory. "We've got our rope," he told Ub, who only pushed his glasses up and said, "Then let's swing." He gathered the staff that afternoon, not to declare victory, but to share the load of it. "We've bought time," he said, and that adjective, bought, put shine and ache on every face. "It is not a miracle," he added. "It's a vote. We have to count it with our hands." He told them where the line would tighten and where the line would hold. He told them he would cut his own pay again. He told them what he would not cut: the patience for an eye to be right, the breath before a joke, the space that lets music find where it belongs. "We will not hurry where the heart would notice," he said. The room didn't cheer. It settled, which is a stronger thing. Work changed temperature. It ran hotter at the edges, cooler at the core. Lunches shortened by habit, not command. Evenings stretched just enough to be considered sacrifice rather than theft. A letter from Europe arrived with its last paragraph apologizing for a border. "Soon," the exhibitor promised. And Roy touched the page the way you touch a hand through a window. A painter named Grace discovered that her clean blue could bruise if a drop of violet leaned near, and the deer's eye deepened again. Someone cried quietly in the dark and did not apologize. A young animator drew a cricket leaning on the truth like a cane, and found himself ashamed of every small lie he'd ever told. The next day he brought flowers to the Incas because beauty is heavy and they carried it. Weeks bent into a new shape around the loan, the risk, the relentless politeness of invoices. The features took their turns in the world, some with applause that rang like bells, some with applause that sounded like encouragement at a cliff. Fantasia's symphonies spilled beyond their frames and needed theatres to be rebuilt for them. Some were, some weren't, and the ledger recorded both devotion and delay. Pinocchio's heart was praised by critics who paid in adjectives rather than receipts. Bambi took too long and exactly the right length and cost both what it should and what it couldn't. The studio learned that the truth of a forest has a tax. Through it all, the little mouse whistled, waved, and kept the lights honest. Mickey visited policemen and parades, farmyards and factories, looking out at the audience with that democratic gaze that says, "I see you," and means it. He paid for lunches and paint and the squeak of a cart's wheel. He paid for disappointments that could be fixed, and for experiments that could not. He smiled at letters from children who drew his ears wrong, and somehow exactly right. But beneath the movement, something was gathering like weather you only notice when the wind shifts at the nape of your neck. Meetings grew fuller. The word union stopped being a shadow and became a noun with a time and a place. The studio's heartbeat, which had learned so many tempos, felt a new rhythm overlaying it, orderly, civic, passionate, insistent. Walt felt it not as betrayal but as a reckoning with a truth he had tried to outwork. That loyalty and fairness are twins that do not like being separated. One night, late, he stood again at the window where day turned the parking lot to mirror and night turned it to question. The sketch lay open on his desk, a gate with lanterns, a street with stitched brick, a boat with a smile that suggested the river would agree to a story's rules. He traced the arch lightly with one finger, the way you trace a name on a headstone or a cheek you love when it's sleeping. He whispered, "Not yet," to the drawing and then, surprising himself, "Soon." He closed the folder and for a final minute before leaving, walked the hallway. The apprenticeship of a building to a man. The mouse in his frame grinned. The broom leaned. The deer did not blink. He could hear, distantly, the murmur of a meeting that had not yet happened and would change how mornings felt. He could also hear, inside something that was larger than hearing, the brass of a band that did not exist yet, leading a parade down a street that only did in his head. Both sounds were true. Both were coming. He switched off the light. The door clicked. The night took him like a breath drawn for a long swim. Tomorrow would insist on new terms, not from a bank this time, but from the people whose hands had been making magic while the world learned the price of it. And out beyond the hedges, a piece of land waited with the patience of earth for a family bold enough to try to build delight you could walk through. He arrived before dawn to a sky the colour of unspoken news. The gate creaked, and his footsteps sounded like the period at the end of a long sentence that refused to finish. In the quiet office, he laid two things side by side on the desk, a fresh stack of time cards and the folded sketch of a gate to somewhere that didn't exist yet. Payroll and possibility, both thin, both binding. He balanced them with his palms as if they might slide off into two different futures if he let go. By 7, the lot stirred. The cat performed its rounds like a ritual the sun depended on. In ink and paint, lamps spilled their small daylight across rows of glass. Brushes dipped, lifted, breathed. In scoring, a clarinet rehearsed a phrase that remembered a cricket's advice and a boy's better self. The multiplane sighed to life. Glass rose and fell as if the building were breathing on purpose. Work, immaculate and ordinary, took the stage and bowed to no one. On the bulletin board, a notice for a vote was tacked hard enough to bite the cork. Beside it, someone had pinned a photograph from the Cathay Circle premiere. Hats, smiles, a tower lit like a candle. And for a second, the two papers looked like disputing relatives pressed shoulder to shoulder at a family table. "Remember," the photo whispered. "Respect," the notice replied. A painter named Grace smoothed the edge of the notice, then went to her station and mixed blue until the deer's eye could hold two kinds of weather at once. At noon, folding chairs gathered in lines, and men and women sat with hands that had learned to disguise fatigue as patience. Roy spoke first, because numbers should arrive before emotion if you want emotion to survive. He explained the ledgers, the rain in Europe, the cost of sound that could travel like a ghost, the way a forest painted with love charged interest. He did not plead. He measured. Walt followed, and he tried something harder than persuasion. He told them the truth he owed. "We made promises to the audience," he said, "and we made promises to you. I won't pit those promises against each other. I am too proud to beg, and not proud enough to pretend I don't need you. If you vote a union, we will live with that truth and build around it. If you don't, then I must listen harder and earlier to the places the building leaks." He looked out and saw not a crowd, but 100 singular faces he knew by the tilt of their jokes. "I don't want to win this," he finished, quiet as a pencil lifted from paper. "I want to deserve staying in the same room." They voted. The day held its breath, and then exhaled into a new arrangement of the same people. Papers were filed, tempers cooled by increments. There were still arguments. There would always be arguments where art and rent shared a kitchen, but the house stood, and the roof learned how to bend without letting weather through. In the afternoon, a memo went out with new terms. In the evening, the cafeteria sounded almost like before. Spoons, laughter, two men trading baseball scores in the corner, a woman humming the melody that had threaded itself into 3 different pictures, and somehow still had more to say. Outside the fence, events marched with boots on. Europe dimmed, then darkened. A cable arrived with a number that used to be a market, and now was a memory. Roy circled it in red and folded the paper once, then twice. On the radio, voices mentioned ships and skies and words that sounded like iron. In the model shop, a small wooden village took shape on a table. Streets, a clock tower, a train that could pretend to be a promise. For a short, someone said, or something longer. Someone else added without looking up. That night, after the vote and the memos and the slow mending that follows any blunt truth, he stayed late. The studio emptied into the city's swallow. He returned to the office and opened the sketch once more. A gate arched, lanterns welcomed. The first street stepped forward, as if already used to footfall. He tried to imagine the sound of it, the low brass of a morning march, the clatter and chatter of wheels that chose cheer, the soft hydraulics of safety disguised as spectacle. He could almost smell warm sugar and machine oil, and the particular cleanliness that only careful hands can make. The mouse would be there somewhere, not as a king but as a host. Families would walk in and find that the ordinary had been asked, very politely, to be extraordinary for a day. And behind it all, capital, numbers nailed under the joy like hidden joists, the ledger's logic learning to duet with delight. He folded the paper back to its square and slipped it into his pocket like a secret kept not out of shame, but out of the need for ripeness. Some dreams bloom too early and are mistaken for weeds. On his way out, he stopped by the screening room. The blank screen waited with the same blank grace it had the night he had first said, "Feature." He stood in the doorway, hand on the jamb, and let a string of seconds spool. He heard, faint as weather approaching, 2 futures calling at once. One was the steady hum of film, projects stacked, sequences solved, the next premiere's hush rising toward applause. The other was the deeper, stranger murmur of a place that wasn't on any map yet. Tracts and permits, loans with teeth, shovels biting earth. A main street that could teach manners to nostalgia without scolding it. Fantasy, capital, and the empire of imagination. 3 notes in one chord that would either resolve or clash, depending on the hand that held them. Behind him, the hallway light flicked, warning the night guard's tour. He stepped into the dark, closed the door, and walked the long line to the exit. At the glass, he could see himself doubled. Man and outline, founder and son, employer and artist. A brother whose name had become a surname that had become a brand, and might soon be a geography. He unlocked the door and let the cooler air lift the last heat from his face. The street beyond the gate offered its usual, humble walking distance. To the corner, to the car, to the future that asks for gas money before it surrenders a mile. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the sketch like a pulse. Far away, a field slept that would one day be mowed into avenues. In the nearer distance, a bank rested with the patience of mortar. Tomorrow would bring calls about distribution, about wartime contracts, about wages adjusted and hours rephrased, about a composer who wanted one more day and a banker who didn't. And somewhere between those calls, he would drive out to look at land. He would stand in dust and picture cleanliness. He would hear brass where only insects played. He turned the key in the lock and let the tumblers answer. Behind him, the studio settled into its night posture. Spines cracked, shoulders down, dreams invited to roam the halls. When the door clicked shut, the sound felt like a chapter ending itself. And on the other side of that sound, waiting, patient, inevitable, was a question that would build a city of answers. He drove out to the valley where the land kept its own counsel. Morning's first warmth slid across low grasses. Fence posts made a metronome out of distance. He pulled off the road where the dirt turned generous and stood with his hands in his pockets, the wind using his coat as a sail. Here, there were no deadlines, only birds in a tractor somewhere complaining against habit. He closed one eye and made a frame with thumb and finger, the way he always did when he needed to convince himself that the invisible could be seen if you stood in the right place long enough. He pictured a train that did not hurry and a boat that did not ask for oceans. A street that began with a welcome and ended with gratitude. He heard brass, he smelled bread and varnish, and the kind of clean that isn't sterile because it has been made by hands that care. A pickup rattled past, the driver tipping 2 fingers from the wheel in a salute that belonged to an older America and still had work left to do. Walt tipped back, then looked again across the lots, flat, stubborn, waiting. He could feel numbers trying to climb into his vision and weigh it down. Surveys, taxes, grades, lines of credit strung from banks like laundry between buildings. He let the numbers sit on the fence for a minute, like sparrows while he tested the dream's spine. It held. He folded the sketch in his pocket by feel, the paper creasing on old grooves, and turned back toward the road. At the studio, the day had already started to argue with itself. A memo from the War Department sat on Roy's desk. Work for Patriot reels, training films, propaganda with a grin because the world had found reasons to frown. Overseas receipts collapsed into silence. Europe's doors were not closed so much as barricaded by necessity and fear. "We'll make what we can for those who need it," Roy said. Eyes on a map you couldn't buy in a store. "We'll keep the lamp lit here." Walt nodded. The room smelled of pencil shavings and coffee and the metallic, medicinal scent of new resolve. He gathered the story crew and the effects boys and the painters and the women at the ink tables and told them this: that the world had put its foot on the brake, and they would help where they could, and they would keep the gears oiled for later. "It won't be easy," he said, as if they hadn't all learned the price of that true sentence in 3 languages already. "But the audience still has hearts, and they still need them eased. We will not close that shop." He sent a team south on goodwill tours, sketches traded for handshakes, shorts made from new corners of the continent, to keep a bridge from collapsing under politics. It helped. Not enough. Enough. Some nights, the studio felt like a ship in a floating fog bank. Horn low, lamps cautious. He walked the halls, the sound of his shoes frankly human on tile, not the swagger of a conqueror, not the stealth of a defeated man. On a soundstage, a canvas backdrop hung waiting as if for weather to be invented. In scoring, a marimba line poked its head out from under a stack of charts and claimed the right to exist. In ink and paint, a woman with hair pinned into an argument finished a frame and blew on it, breath becoming gloss. He watched and thought, not miracle labor, not magic, craft dressed in repetition until it surprises even itself. The new union terms found their rhythm. There were stumbles and corrections, not always graceful, but a raised hand now meant a question that might be answered. Not a warning about a door that would not open. He learned to live with the paperwork that followed fairness, the way shadows follow noon. Present, sometimes unwelcome, proof of light. He swallowed pride when it disguised itself as clarity, and listened longer when he wanted to talk. He sent flowers more, not as apology, but as reminder, that they were making something tender in a world currently obsessed with the opposite. War work kept the lights, thin but steady. The mouse saluted politely when asked. Between contracts, he returned to deer and dwarfs and wooden boys, stories that breathed, not marched. The ledger, meanwhile, learned a new gate. Grants, net 30, advances attached to promises that felt like thorns tied to balloons. Walt stared at columns and, for the first time, felt truly outnumbered by arithmetic. He was not ashamed. Mathematics, like weather, cannot be insulted into changing. It can only be weighted out, worked through, or leveraged. "Dreams on credit," he murmured one twilight, the phrase sour and sweet, and Roy looked up as if the words had knocked politely at his desk and asked to come in. "If that's the road," Roy said, "we'll keep it paved." They leaned harder on distribution at home, packed more shorts with wartime manners, let the features step out when they could. Applause came soft and earnest, the kind that sounds like thanks for a rest stop on a long road. This was not the roaring, flower-hurling adoration of that first December. This was a cup of water in a city of smoke. He learned to value it more. The mouse learned to wear it well. The staff learned to go home at night to blackout curtains and ration books, and the relief of radio announcers who could say no news without becoming liars. In those days, the park sketch lived inside a desk drawer under a leather blotter inside a man. He took it out only when the room was so quiet even the mouse had stopped whistling. He drew another line, moved a lamp an inch on the page, slid a train slightly to the right. He added a bench where a mother might sit without thinking about money. He added a trash can that looked like it meant to do its job. He added a man sweeping, quietly heroic, the way cleanliness always is when done with dignity. Then he folded it again, the crease warm now from frequent folding, and put it back not because he doubted, but because he loved this dream enough to let it mature. Letters kept arriving. Children who had seen features at matinees in small towns wrote about cartoons and courage in the same paragraph and did not apologize for the pairing. A soldier scribbled from a foxhole, ink pooling where dirt resisted. "Saw the mouse with the broom," he wrote. "Made the boys laugh." Laughed myself. "Needed that. Do it again." A girl wrote from Detroit to say she had never seen a princess work, and now that she had, she thought maybe she should too. He pinned those notes on a board behind his desk with the quiet pressure of a man who understands the real currency his company trades in. Roy read them after hours when the math ran thin and let them count as a kind of interest paid on time they did not have. The day came when the war contracts began to fade, like paint under sun. Europe stretched from grief back toward appetite, slow as a limb waking. American wallets found their old weight. The theatres dusted their aisles with sugar again. Walt felt the current shift and knew you only get a little while to plant in such weather. "One more big one," he told the staff at a Monday meeting, voice steady, not defiant. "Not because the wolf has gone, but because the wolf never leaves and we cannot live always in his shadow." Eyes met his, tired and glad. Pencils tapped the desk. 1-2, 1-2, the small, brave drumbeat of a civilian army, that night, in the small projection room where his strongest vows always tested their legs. He threaded sample reels and watched faces flicker to life on white. A puppet becoming a boy through choices, a stag standing his ground without rage, a mouse turning a broom into an orchestra, because obedience requires wisdom as much as willingness. "What do we ask for next?" he wondered aloud. The screen did not answer. Screens never do. They only mirror. But somewhere beneath the thin hum of the projector, he could hear a newer question stepping into place, boots scuffing, as if waiting to be invited into the sentence. What if the audience didn't just watch a world? What if they walked inside it? He stood very still, as if motion might frighten the future away. In his pocket, the folded paper felt like a heartbeat you could hold. Outside, the city exhaled the last smoke of a long decade. Inside, pencils waited, lamps cooled, the cat made a final patrol and approved the halls with a small sound. He clicked the projector off. Darkness arrived not harshly, but like an oath. He sat, sensing the cliff without fearing it this time. In the morning, he would make calls that asked bankers to believe in streets. He would ask engineers who had never built rides to build grace. He would draw up a new kind of contract with the same old words: time, money, trust, and mean them the way he always had, but for a landscape, not just a screen. He would tell Roy, "It's land," and Roy would look at the numbers the way a farmer eyes a sky and says, "We can risk planting if the wind minds itself." He would face the world with the oldest sales pitch in America and the youngest: "Bring your family. Bring your doubt. We will give you a day that puts both where they belong." He turned the lobby light off with a knuckle, the click neatly final. He knew he wasn't closing the chapter on a victory. He was closing a chapter on a vow. And as he stepped into the rinse dark of the parking lot, the thought that reached for him was not a boast and not a warning. It was a bridge. Tomorrow, he would borrow against a dream again. Dreams on credit morning leaned through the blinds in straight, careful lines, and the studio answered with motion. The kind of motion that looks like work until you hear its hidden rhythm and realize it's hope. Walt walked the corridor with a fistful of schedules that rustled like dry leaves promising shade. Roy was already at his desk with the day open like a map. Their shoes made two kinds of sounds on the floor. One that meant now, one that meant later. Between them, a ledger waited to be convinced, and a dream waited to be collateral. He had done it once. Bet a whole future on a girl who sang to a well, and on 7 small men who spoke in jokes the size of truth. It had paid back in applause and paper. But paper, once stacked, learns bad habits. It flattens itself into courage you think you can spend again forever. "We can go bigger," he said, and heard his brother's quiet answer ripple the air. "We can go smarter." The walls smelled of graphite and fresh lumber. Someone down the hall tuned a violin until the pitch lit up the room like a match. The next pictures were not just scripts, they were storms with music inside them. A wooden boy who learned that lies make a nose grow the way debt makes promises thin. A sorcerer's apprentice who learned power without wisdom repeats its mistakes until the floor drowns. A faun who learned the forest is a choir that sings both joy and silence. Each idea walked in on 2 feet and left on hundreds, carried by hands that clocked in, clocked out, and slipped their invisible names into every frame. "How much?" asked the bank. "Enough," said Roy, which is another way of saying not enough. Yet, contracts arrived like weather. Paperclips had to learn to hold more than they were built for. Engineers bolted the multiplane to patience and invented depth, 1 plate of glass at a time. In ink and paint, women folded their hair into obedience and coaxed colour into truth. "If I add a breath of violet here," Grace murmured over a dish of blue, "the eye will say winter without a word." Nearby, a young animator etched the exact pause before a laugh. "Don't hurry the smile," he whispered to the pencil. "Let the heart get there first." The soundmen worked a different forge. They walked a new invention, the Fantasound, around the room like a careful animal, teaching it to move without breaking the chairs. "You'll hear the river pass behind you," a mixer promised, and the banker blinked as if music had just learned a new verb in front of him. The promise came on a wire that could carry wonder and cost at the same time. "We'll retrofit the theatres," someone in distribution swore. "Some will," Roy corrected, pen chewing the margin. "Some will bless us from the lobby and send the feature on its way." At lunch, the cafeteria rehearsed its debates. How to choose between speed and grace. How to price a silence that makes a scene honest. How to forgive a leader who needs what he cannot afford and asks anyway. Walt spoke in the middle of the room, never above it. "We keep the breath before the joke," he told them. "We keep the eye that tells the truth. We cut my pay. We don't cut the beat that makes a child lean forward." He smiled, not for charm, but to keep the courage loose in the air. The loans came with clauses like teeth hidden in honey. Roy translated them into days and kept a jar of antacids in his drawer like talismans. He mortgaged a corner of next year to fix this Friday. Walt mortgaged his name again and didn't flinch. Not because he loved risk, but because he loved the moment an audience believes. Loves it the way farmers love rain that arrives when it should. "It's not gambling," he told Lillian on the porch. Evening crickets stitching a small song around them. "It's buying time for the better story." She touched his hand. "Then pay attention to the cost," she said, and he nodded because she had the only veto he feared. Premieres came and taught humility. Pinocchio glowed like a lantern carried through fog. Critics followed it with praise that couldn't pay for new microphones. Fantasia swept the screen like weather and asked theatres to change themselves. Some did, and the rooms turned into sea. Others didn't, and sound sat like a caged bird at the proscenium. Bambi walked in last on knees that had learned grace the hardest way. "We're making poems and paying for them with bridges," Roy sighed. And then, because he was the brother who balanced despair with work, he ordered more lumber for the next one. Beyond the fence, the world scowled. Europe shut its doors and sent silence in stamped envelopes. The studio took war contracts and learned again that patriotism smells like ink and coffee, and the tired warmth of a night spent finishing something that mattered. The mouse saluted when asked, then returned to his ordinary cheer like a dependable uncle. At home, ration books replaced recipes. At work, meetings replaced rumours. Union, the word arrived and refused to leave. And Walt learned a second kind of timing, the kind where you stop speaking so you can learn what your people think you owe them. They voted. Papers were signed, tempers cooled like steel in water, hissing first, then strong enough to build with. Right after, he went to the small theatre where every vow had been drafted and watched a rough cut alone, hands folded as if the picture were a prayer. On the screen, a boy in a cap took a risk he couldn't afford for a friend he couldn't lose. The room breathed with him. "That's the bargain," he said to the empty chairs. "We risk for the thing that keeps us human." But risk doesn't only walk in during art. It comes in through the ledger. New lines of credit crossed the page like wires over a field. He could almost hear them hum. A banker leaned forward and said, "We'll extend, provided." And the word provided set up a card table in Walt's chest and shuffled a deck full of interest. He signed. The pen made a small, brave sound. He pressed the blotter down and thought, just for a heartbeat, about how ink looks like courage when it's drying, and like obligation when it's dry. When the day ran out of explanations, he drove. Orange groves turned brown and secrets turned into plans. He parked beside a field and unfolded a sketch that had learned the shape of his pocket. A gate arched. Lanterns glowed. A train circled a town that promised welcome. "I want a place where stories walk around," he told the wind. And the wind being wind did not argue. He folded the paper again. Then, smiling at his own superstition, folded it one more time for luck. Back on the lot, a letter waited from a soldier who had seen Mickey share the screen with marching drums. "I laughed," the man wrote. "Forgot where I was for 6 minutes. That's a miracle where I am." Roy read it and set it in a drawer he never locked, so he could take it out on the worst days and let it count as a kind of deposit the bank didn't understand. Walt pinned a copy near his desk, not to flatter himself, but to remember why credit had a right to meet imagination in the first place. The studio hummed toward a new edge. Payroll met Friday by minutes. A blue for the deer's eye deepened until it carried grief without spilling it. Engineers threaded wires under chairs in a test theatre and learned where goosebumps live. Young artists found their names printed small in a crawl and phoned their mothers with a pride that made distance forgive itself. The mouse, eternal apprentice to joy, kept the lights paid between experiments that hurt and healed, and sometimes did both at once. And under it all, like a bass note you only feel after the orchestra stops, a question gathered its weight. Could an idea be built of wood and brass and concrete, financed with the same stubborn faith that had rented garage space and borrowed microphones? Could fantasy keep its soul while standing on footings and paying property tax? He didn't know. He only knew this. The world was ready to rest inside a story, not just watch one. He stepped into Roy's office at dusk. The ledger opened to a page called Tomorrow. "One more loan," he said. Roy nodded without sighing. "One more," he agreed. And in that old exchange was a pact. Fear would do the math. Courage would sign the line, and both would carry the weight without dropping what mattered. The phone rang. A banker cleared his throat, a new clause put on its hat. The banker's voice threaded offers through the wire, each clause shaped like a gate you could pass only if you bowed. Roy listened with the patience of a man who had taught wolves to wait by counting out Fridays. Walt stood at the window and watched a boy kick a can down the alley. It made a sweet tinny sound, like a small parade warming up. "We'll need collateral not made of paper," the banker said. "Stone, land, rights." Rights to what? To dreams, perhaps. The only property this family had ever cultivated at scale. When the call ended, the room held a new angle. "Land," Roy said, voicing the heavier noun as if testing its teeth. Walt nodded, more relieved than daunted. The sketch in his pocket had been asking for exactly that word. "Land," he echoed, and the syllable rolled through him like a train that knew where it was headed. He began to drive different roads. He learned the grammar of acreage, zoning, frontage, easements, drainage, the prose of mud and permits. He stood with surveyors who made geometry look like patience, and listened to farmers who measured time in crops and trust. Fields unrolled in every direction, a quilt of stubborn greens and browns. He tasted dust and optimism, and the bitter coffee sold out of a thermos at the edge of an argument. "Not too close to the ocean," he told Roy, tracing circles on his map. "Fog steals colour." "Not too close to the old studios," Roy added, tapping another corner. "Curiosity steals quiet." They looked inland, where oranges kept their own counsel, and trains remembered to slow down. The bank wanted a partner who could turn air into certainty. Walt turned to a new kind of theatre. Television, a blue-lit box that had begun to sit in living rooms like an altar whose rituals were still being invented. "We make them a weekly invitation," he said, voice picking up that conductor's cadence, "and they help us build the place where the invitation becomes real." Day after day, he sat in rooms where suits breathed recirculated confidence and explained, with a salesman's courtesy and a missionary's heat, a show that would sell not a plot but a place. He drew maps in the margins of contracts and watched executives lean forward when the train circled his sketch town. One network said maybe with an eyebrow. Another said no with a smile. A third said yes with conditions that sounded like toll booths on a bridge they hadn't paid to pour. Back at the studio, people worked on pictures and on futures at once. The mouse kept paying for flour, paint, and patience. Short films taught manners to rationed joy and stood politely aside when war reels asked for the stage. In an empty corner of a warehouse, carpenters built a little street from scrap and hope, a miniature town where scale models stood for biographies. Walt would crouch there at night, eye level with a toy lamppost, and move a tiny bench an inch. "Families wait here," he'd murmur, and the bench obeyed. Letters accelerated, a tide finding its strength again. "Come east," wrote a father from Ohio. "Bring the mouse to our boy. Walt wrote back, and for the first time, offered a different promise. Bring your boy to us. He felt the audacity of that sentence buzz through his bones. It was both dare and welcome, the original American duet. Roy negotiated with the care of a man repairing a clock while it kept time. He carved financing into slices. A share here for broadcast, a share there for land held by a company that had never owned dirt on purpose, a share for rights to fountains and wishes. He kept the ledger honest and the dream solvent, and if you asked him at night whether it was belief or arithmetic keeping them afloat, he'd answer, yes, they found it, a spread of stubborn, sun-browned earth near a town that would learn to pronounce its own name differently because of what would be built beside it. The place lay between highway and hope, not yet claimed by either. Trains nodded as they passed. A realtor talked fast, a county official talked faster. Walt listened past them both to the wind moving the tops of the trees in a time signature he could conduct. Here, he said at last, touching the map as if it could feel. The word landed like a stake. Papers followed, heavy with seals and clauses, maps nested inside maps, like secrets inside family stories. Surveyors set flags that made the field look festive, a birthday party for a future. Roy initialed at corners, skeptical as a guardian angel. Walt signed in the middle of pages, certain as a boy announcing his own name to a new classroom. One clause asked for a road to be widened. Another demanded a canal learn a new route. Money changed pockets with a sound that was neither greed nor grace, just necessity doing its job loudly. Then began the choreography of promises. Walt stood before a camera and spoke to the country on Sunday nights. The grandfatherly calm, the twinkle, the world he described as if it already existed just off screen. He held up drawings and said, Tomorrowland, as if tomorrow were a bird you could teach to land on your wrist. He said Frontierland, and men in Nebraska sat forward because something in the word knew their father's hands. He said Fantasyland, and a million children leaned so hard toward the glass, their breath fogged the room. The show paid for surveys and footings. It also minted trust, the currency you can't print without counterfeit if you don't mean it. On the lot, teams shifted. Some stayed with film, the deer's doctrine of quiet, the mouse's elastic citizenship. Others decamped to the new frontier. Architects with pencils like lances, engineers with pockets full of bolts and metaphors, artists learning to speak concrete without losing poetry. They tested ride vehicles in a parking lot at night, small-wheeled beasts that bucked and complied. They argued about trash cans and parades with the same seriousness they brought to story beats, because this too was narrative. Where a family rests, where a trumpet turns a corner, where a child does not feel lost. The bank called weekly, the network called daily, the county called whenever a pipe met a rule. Roy held it together with scheduling and sleeplessness. Walt held it together with vision and a willingness to admit when something delighted in the wrong direction. Surprise is not chaos, he'd say. It's order disguised as joy. He cut where he must, defended where he should, and deferred only when deferral kept the heart intact. He walked the empty site at dawn, boots painting the dust with temporary history. Flags marked future castles, rivers, rockets, a steamboat with a whistle already alive in his throat. He bent and picked up a handful of earth. It smelled like pennies and oranges. He closed his fist around it, felt the grit, then opened his hand and let the wind have what it wanted. All right, he told the land, a farmer again for an instant. We'll be guests if you'll be kind, the ledger said thin. The schedule said impossible. The crews said yes with hammers. The camera said on Sunday night, wait till you see. And the country believed, because belief had been rehearsed for years in dark rooms where laughter rescued the weak. One evening, near the fence line, he watched a grader crawl across the field like a patient animal. In his pocket, the sketch felt less like paper and more like a key warming to a hand. We're really going to do it, he told Roy, almost surprised at the verb's steadiness. Roy nodded, eyes on the lights of distant cars threading the highway. Customers, critics, families, Fridays. We're doing it already, he said. A gust came off the open ground and lifted dust across the new road. It looked for a second like fog, like magic, like trouble, like dawn. In the swirl, you could almost hear brass tuning, water finding a course, children rehearsing the gasp. They would not know they'd been practicing all their lives. And then the wind fell still. The dust settled, and the question that had been walking beside them stepped into their path and asked, as plainly as any banker and with the innocence of any child, He watched the land shift colors through the weeks. Green at the start, gold by the end, and then grey under the slow scrape of machinery. The dream had left the page. It had become measurable, taxable, finite. Each morning, a convoy of trucks arrived, coughing dust into the air like breath into cold glass. The engines droned, a kind of chant, and steel rods climbed from the earth as if obeying an invisible hymn. Walt wore a hard hat now, though everyone could tell it wasn't his native costume. He would crouch beside surveyors and trace a line on their maps with the tip of a pencil. The same pencil that once drew a mouse and a mountain. "Shift it 2 feet," he'd say, then look up at the horizon and whisper to himself, "That's better." Engineers smiled and called it instinct, but to him it was rhythm, the same rhythm that timed a joke or a dance or a prayer. Roy kept the ledgers dry. He negotiated with contractors who mistook patience for weakness, with bankers who confused risk with sin. At night, he carried numbers home and set them beside his dinner plate. "We're short again," he'd tell Edna, and she'd refill his coffee instead of answering. Each column of debt meant more dirt moved, more nails driven, more future in the making. Summer hit hard. The sun was an overseer that neither bribed nor bargained. Workers in bandanas hoisted beams that would one day hold laughter. The scent of tar and orange peel mixed in the air, an accidental perfume of ambition. Reporters visited and wrote about Walt's folly, the same phrase they'd used for Snow White. He didn't correct them. He knew by now how folly feels just before it changes its name. Blueprints littered his office, kingdoms in blue, empires in inches. He slept less, drove more, ate wherever the light was good enough to read by. Sometimes he stood in the middle of the construction site at midnight, the floodlights washing everything white. The wind tugged at his coat, and the unfinished castle threw a long, hopeful shadow toward him. "Don't you dare fall," he told it. It didn't. Weeks turned into a montage only editors could love. A train track completed itself under sweating hands. A riverbed filled with water for the first time, silver under the floodlights. Painters touched up a steamboat that wasn't going anywhere yet, but would soon circle forever in a small, perfect loop. A test parade marched down a street that smelled of sawdust and new paint, led by a man in an oversized mouse head who tripped once, laughed and kept walking. On Sunday nights, the nation watched him on television, sitting calm and bright in front of a map that glowed like a prophecy. "You're going to like it," he'd say, voice as warm as a neighbor's fence. Behind him, clips of construction played, children waving, cranes bowing, America rehearsing delight. People believed because he did. They mailed letters addressed to the happiest place on earth, though the gates hadn't yet been built. Some contained drawings, some coins taped to paper, some prayers written by shaky hands that wanted their children to keep something good in reach. By spring, the park had a heartbeat. You could hear it in the hum of generators, the creak of scaffolds, the thud of hammers setting up the bones of wonder. Workers began to whistle the same tune without realizing it. One day, a storm rolled in, heavy as unpaid rent. Rain hit the dirt like accusation. The site turned to mud. Machines stalled. Walt arrived anyway, stepping out of his car into the downpour. "We'll lose a week," Roy said. "Maybe 2. Walt wiped water from his face. "Then we'll take them back," he answered. The next morning, the sun came out in that grudging Californian way, and the mud began to remember how to be ground again. As July neared, deadlines stopped being numbers and started being ghosts. Crews worked through the night under portable lamps that made the air hum. Plaster dried wrong and was redone. Asphalt steamed under shoes. The castle's spire gleamed like the last star before daylight. Reporters gathered outside the fence, writing their predictions. Too soon, too small, too much. Opening day dawned blistering hot. Traffic choked the new highway. Women in dresses wiped dust from their shoes. Children clutched paper tickets like spells that could open gates. The plumbing rebelled. The asphalt softened and kept the prints of high heels like fossils of joy. But the gates opened. Trumpets played. The television cameras rolled, sweating in the sun. And through it all, Walt walked the main street. He had once drawn smaller than his thumb and now filled with laughter loud enough to shake a century. He paused near the castle and looked back at the crowd, a tide of belief spilling through arches and into worlds that had been sketches and were now streets. Roy stood beside him, pale with exhaustion and pride. "We made it," Walt said. "We're open." Roy smiled, half warning, half blessing. Now we have to stay open. That night, after the fireworks, after the applause, after the critics had filed both praise and complaint in equal measure, Walt sat on a bench near the gate. The park exhaled around him. The smell of sugar, the hum of electricity, the murmur of a janitor sweeping confetti into neat piles. He looked up at the castle, its windows still glowing. "We built a story you can walk inside," he whispered. "Let's keep it true." In the distance, a train whistle echoed, the sound of the first sketch, the first escape, the first promise that had ever taken him away from what was small and toward what might be shared. Tomorrow, the park would fill again. Tomorrow, the empire would need feeding. But for one long breath, he sat in peace, the night cool against his face, the mouse grinning from every souvenir stand, the world humming softly in the language he had taught it. And somewhere beyond that music, just faintly, the next dream stirred. Kingdoms of concrete and sound morning rose over Anaheim like a camera dolly in slow motion, lifting through haze, settling on scaffolds, then finding its focus on a castle that had not yet earned its crown. Dust drifted in beams of light. Radios crackled with country songs and hammer counts. The air smelled of new paint, diesel, and orange peel, the scent of ambition under construction. Walt arrived early, as always. His shoes carried yesterday's dust, his tie already askew, his notebook open before he sat down. "Move that wall 6 feet west," he murmured to no one, tracing the air with his finger. "The light's better there." Around him, men shouted measurements, women painted the sky on panels, and engineers argued with gravity. Somewhere a welder sneezed and cursed softly in Spanish. Someone else laughed. It was chaos. But it was also choreography. An orchestra before it learns it knows the song. Roy stayed at headquarters most days, wrestling the ledgers that now resembled the city itself. Vast, complex, and occasionally on fire. "We've built ourselves into a miracle," he told his accountant, "and miracles are hell to ensure." He called banks, soothed suppliers, kept credit breathing. Walt called it partnership. Roy called it survival. Either way, the park's heart kept beating, uneven, relentless, human. When Walt walked the site, he walked with the confidence of a man who had made the impossible blush before. He stooped to pick up nails, not out of thrift, but superstition. "A nail saved is a laugh earned," he said. Workers smiled. He asked everyone their first name and remembered half of them. He carried a thermos of coffee that cooled faster than he drank it. "We're not building rides," he said once, standing in the dust and noise. "We're building moods, and moods don't leak." The castle rose first, not because it was practical, but because belief needs an anchor. Plaster sculptors shaped stone out of chicken wire and faith. Painters added shadows that did not exist in nature. "How tall?" someone asked. "Tall enough to make the sky jealous," Walt replied. The drawbridge creaked for the first time like a door opening into a collective dream. Children in nearby neighborhoods stopped on their bikes to stare through the fence. The foreman waved them away, but Walt called out, "Let them look!" We're practicing for their arrival. Each land grew like a continent discovering itself. In Frontierland, carpenters stained wood to look like history. In Adventureland, palm trees arrived on trucks from 3 counties, their roots wrapped like secrets. In Tomorrowland, engineers in horn-rimmed glasses tested machines that hummed like questions no one had yet learned to answer. "The future must look friendly," Walt said, adjusting his hat. "If it looks perfect, people will fear it. If it looks hopeful, they'll join it." Television had become the park's patron saint. Each week, America gathered in living rooms to watch him talk about dreams in the same tone most men reserved for weather reports. He made wonder sound practical, and practicality sound wondrous. Ratings soared, and so did donations, sponsors, believers. "He sells happiness," one critic wrote, "and for once, we believe the product is real." Roy believed in paychecks. He fought for everyone. The park was swallowing money faster than joy could earn it. Costs rose like the spires. Deadlines crept closer, teeth bared. "We'll open anyway," Walt said, as if refusal could rewrite the calendar. Roy looked at the numbers, then at his brother. "You're going to give the world a fairy tale," he said quietly. "Just promise me the fairy tale won't eat us alive." Opening day came early because it had to. July 17th, 1955. The gates were painted an hour before the cameras rolled. The air trembled with heat, over 100 degrees, and television cables melted like taffy. Traffic snarled for miles. Tickets were counterfeited faster than they could be printed. Water fountains failed. Asphalt softened. Shoes stuck and pulled free with sighs. A gas leak closed half of Fantasyland. A host's high heels sank into Main Street and stayed there, a relic before its time. But the cameras caught only smiles, and the nation saw only magic. Walt walked through the chaos calm as a prayer. "It's alive," he told a reporter, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It's breathing. It's learning to walk." The reporter asked if he was disappointed by the problems. "No," Walt said. "Even dreams have teething pains." That night, when the last guest had left, the park sighed. Workers sat on curbs eating sandwiches from wax paper. The castle glowed pale blue, exhausted and proud. Walt stood alone on Main Street, the lights buzzing overhead, and whispered, "We did it." His voice was hoarse. "Roy," he said to the empty air, "we did it." Then softer. "Now, let's make it better." He kept his word. Every morning, he walked the park before the gates opened, waving to gardeners, checking bolts, brushing paint dust off railings. Children's laughter drifted faintly from the speakers still testing their morning tracks. He called the place a show, never a business. Every attraction had a story. Every story had a lesson. Bravery, curiosity, kindness, persistence. "The park isn't about escape," he told a reporter later. "It's about remembering who you are when the world's not watching." Roy watched the receipts and realized something impossible had happened. The park was paying for itself. The crowds were rivers. The rivers were constant. Sponsors lined up to buy their own corners of the dream. The brothers met in the park's small office one evening, papers stacked like trophies between them. "We're solvent," Roy said. Walt grinned. "Then let's dream bigger." Roy laughed, weary and proud. "That's the problem with you, kid. You treat balance sheets like blueprints." As years turned, Disneyland became more than a park. It was an idea wearing shoes. It taught industries new languages, storytelling as engineering, hospitality as theatre, architecture as empathy. Rivals studied it like scripture. Children remembered it like home. "It's not perfect," Walt said, "but neither is life. That's why it works." And yet behind the music and clean streets, exhaustion settled in his bones. He coughed more, slept less, talked in sketches instead of sentences. "We've made a good start," he told Lillian on the porch one night. "But I keep thinking, what if there's more land, more story, more tomorrow?" She smiled sadly. "There's always more tomorrow, Walt," she said. "Just don't forget today." He didn't, but he also didn't stop, because somewhere in the back of his mind, another train had begun to move, one bound for Florida, where swamps could become futures, where imagination could grow without fences, where his empire of sound and concrete might learn to dream all over again. And as that new whistle began to echo faintly through his thoughts, the chapter he'd built in Anaheim settled into history, a living history, still humming with laughter, still whispering one unending invitation: step inside. The story's waiting. The family and the company night softened the streets of Los Angeles. In the quiet office above Buena Vista, the lights still burned long after the janitor's keys had chimed their final note. Papers covered the desk, contracts, memos, letters with names both familiar and newly ambitious. At the edge of the desk, a photograph faced the window, Walt and Roy standing in front of the castle, both smiling, both pretending the world wasn't moving faster than they could. Time had become an impatient collaborator. The studio was now an empire, and empires, unlike stories, have no natural ending. They grow until someone dares to stop them, or forgets to. Walt still carried a sketchbook. Roy still carried the weight of the numbers. The brothers, once a pair of adventurers chasing laughter, had become custodians of something heavier than joy: legacy. In the mornings, Walt's cough echoed through the halls. He brushed it off as studio dust. Doctors whispered, smoking, stress, lungs. Lillian worried quietly. "You never slow down," she said. "If I do, the dream might notice," he replied. And the truth was, he was afraid to stand still. Standing still meant the credits might start to roll, aye. The shadow between brothers, Roy had aged differently. He wore his worry like a well-ironed suit. His eyes, once sharp with skepticism, had softened into the gaze of a man who knows the price of miracles. He kept the company breathing with careful arithmetic, while Walt kept it dreaming with reckless grace. The difference between them was the same as it had always been. Roy made the ground solid. Walt made the sky worth reaching. "Florida," Walt said one morning, his voice bright as if speaking to a child about a secret. "There's room there, enough for a city that works." Roy rubbed his temples. "A city?" Walt nodded. Not a park, a place that runs right, where imagination doesn't just entertain, it organizes. Roy looked at him long, tired but fond. You'll kill yourself trying to save the future, he said. Then at least it'll die inspired, Walt answered. Meetings followed. Maps unfolded like prophecies. Lawyers filled ashtrays. Disney World began as an idea spoken softly and ended as an architectural war cry. Walt called it the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Epcot. He wrote it in block letters as if etching a monument. It'll be clean, he said. It'll be efficient. It'll be happy. He said it the way a father describes the child he never had time to raise. But in the same breath that built new worlds, old wounds whispered. Roy watched his brother turn from dreamer to architect, and the gulf widened. You can't plan happiness, Roy said once. You can only make room for it. Then let's make room, Walt replied. That was how they fought, not in anger, but in echo. One building, one budget, one unfinished apology at a time. The weight of a name. The company had grown too large to fit inside its founder's skin. Television, film, music, parks, merchandise. The hydra of success wore Walt's face, and he was both proud and imprisoned by it. He could no longer walk through Disneyland without being mobbed by admiration. Is he real? A child asked, tugging at his mother's sleeve. The question followed him like a shadow. Executives began speaking of the brand. Walt flinched at the word. A brand is for cattle, he said. We make stories. But stories were now products, and products had shareholders. Meetings grew longer, rooms colder. Once, a young marketing director suggested changing the castle's color scheme to refresh the image. Walt stared at him for a long minute. Son, he said finally, that castle's been paid for in dreams. Don't repaint the rent. Lillian watched him fade under fluorescent light. The studio was busier than ever. New films, new faces, new accountants. She missed the days when he'd come home smelling of pencil shavings and hope. Now he came home late, quiet, his hands trembling slightly when he reached for tea. You built a family, she told him. It's just bigger than you thought. He smiled, tired. Families fight, he said. Companies forget to. He tried to fix it the only way he knew, by imagining something else. He took the Florida project and turned it into a manifesto. We'll show the world how to live, he told his engineers, voice hoarse but burning. Not in theory, in practice. We'll make the future visible. He showed them sketches of circular cities, elevated trains, clean air, smiling faces. It was the gospel of progress written in blue ink. And yet, as he spoke, his breath shortened. The room with no windows, November 1966. The air in the hospital smelled of bleach and false comfort. Machines hummed, tubes whispered. Walt lay staring at the ceiling tiles, arranging them into constellations. Roy sat beside the bed, hands folded, eyes damp but steady. They'll finish it, Roy said. Everything. The park, the films. I'll see to it. Walt nodded. You always do. He turned his head slightly. You remember the window over the firehouse? He asked. Roy frowned. The one on Main Street? Yeah, Walt whispered. Keep the lamp burning there, for when I come back. Roy swallowed hard. All right, he said. The next morning, December light crept over Burbank. The lamp in that window glowed softly, stubbornly. Walt Disney was gone like Fee, the afterlight. The company paused. It didn't weep loudly. It held its breath. The studios worked in silence. Animators sharpened pencils they didn't use. Janitors polished doorknobs twice. In Anaheim, the park opened on schedule. But guests noticed something different. The music seemed gentler. The colors less hurried. Feels quieter, someone said. Like it's listening. Roy returned to his desk, thinner than he had ever been, and began to build again. He wanted Epcot, he told the board. We'll give him Epcot. He visited Florida, walked the swamp, and saw what his brother had seen, space enough for dreams to stretch without tripping. He drove a stake into the ground and said, This is for Walt. The work nearly broke him, but he refused to stop. Every blueprint carried his brother's handwriting in invisible ink. Every contract was a promise kept. When the park opened in 1971, Roy stood at the gates and whispered, This is his land, but it's our work. 2 months later, his heart gave out. The brothers had crossed the finish line together, just on different sides of the sky. V. The family of inheritors. In the years that followed, the name Disney transformed again. It no longer belonged to one man or even one family. It belonged to the world. Children who had never seen Walt alive knew his smile from Sunday broadcasts. The company became a kingdom run by heirs of imagination and ambition alike. Some guarded the art, others guarded the stock. What would Walt do? Became both prayer and marketing strategy. In the hallways, portraits watched. The mouse grinned from every corner. A totem, a witness, a reminder that joy could outlive its maker. The lamp above the firehouse still burned, a small sun refusing to set. And sometimes, in the park after closing, when the speakers slept, and the wind carried faint music from the carousel, workers swore they could hear footsteps crossing Main Street, slow, steady, familiar. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was a man who had learned that dreams don't end. They evolve. He had given the world a story that refused to stop telling itself. And somewhere, between the ledger and the lantern, between the family and the company, between the real and the imagined, that story was still writing him back. The empire of imagination, the light begins on a screen, blue, soft, endless. A logo glows like a sunrise. Somewhere a child laughs. Somewhere else an executive's pen clicks. Somewhere unseen, a composer hums a melody that hasn't yet met its story. The empire hums awake, vast and familiar. The lamp above the firehouse still burns, but now its light touches continents. Either kingdom expands. After the brothers, the world learned how to run on their machinery of wonder. The studio grew not by inches but by atmospheres. New films, new parks, new satellites of magic spun outward from the same small gravity. Belief. We sell happiness, one executive said. And perhaps he was right, but the product had outgrown its shelf. Disney was no longer a name. It was a climate. In Tokyo, steel and glass bowed politely before imagination. In Paris, laughter learned a new accent. In Florida, swamps turned to skylines. Every spire, every boat, every smiling parade was a translation of one man's pencil line. The sun never sets on our stories, a manager quipped, half joking, half prophetic. And beneath the fireworks, the balance sheets glowed hotter than the skies. Yet in every corner of expansion lived contradiction. The parks preached innocence. The corporation practiced empire. Dreams became commodities. Ticketed, trademarked, globalized. A father from Ohio could walk the same Main Street as a banker from Seoul, each thinking they were in the same story, but each paying different prices to believe it. The mouse, once a mischievous cartoon, had become both saint and CEO, too. The golden screen cinema changed, and the company changed with it. Animation became pixels instead of paint. The hands that once brushed watercolor skies now coded them. It's still magic, a young artist said. Just faster. Old animators frowned, nostalgic for graphite and gravity. A computer doesn't sweat, one muttered. It doesn't dream either, replied another. But the screens did dream. Of toys that felt, lions that sang, oceans that remembered their gods. The company's second golden age arrived not with trumpets, but with algorithms. The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King. Each a hymn to emotion, each a cathedral built in sound and light. Audiences wept, not because they believed the animals could talk, but because the stories remembered that humans could. Roy E. Disney, the nephew, the bridge, kept the flame alive through boardrooms that spoke the dialect of dividends. The soul of the thing, he said, must always outweigh the sale of the thing. But even he knew how fragile that balance was. Behind the curtains of creativity, mergers loomed, and capital wore costumes of kindness. When the company acquired new kingdoms, Pixar, Marvel, Lucasfilm, the empire grew its mythology and its margins. Old fans sighed, new fans cheered. We're saving stories, executives said. We're buying safety, critics whispered. The truth, as always, lived in the space between preservation through possession, art by acquisition. And somewhere in that tangle, Walt's ghost smiled faintly, recognizing both the audacity and the danger of his own invention. The empire and its shadows. No empire grows without its shadows. Workers in the parks, under the smiling suns of corporate brochures, whispered of wages that couldn't buy the very joy they sold. Animators watched deadlines sharpen into weapons. Unions returned like long-forgotten refrains. Dreaming is expensive, one said, and we're the ones paying. Online, a new frontier unfolded. Fans built temples of pixels. Forums, theories, timelines, alternate histories of the stories they loved. Some worshipped, Others questioned. The mouse had become myth, and myths invite both devotion and heresy. Debates flared. Was the dream too perfect? Too polished? Too loud? A critic wrote, "The company doesn't just reflect culture, it scripts it." Perhaps that was true. Perhaps that was inevitable. Still, the magic endured. The parks filled, the films soared, and the music stitched itself into generations. At weddings, children, funerals, protests, Disney songs hummed like shared DNA. For all its machinery, the empire still knew how to touch the pulse. Fufa. The future that never sleeps, in a glass building humming with servers. Engineers coded the next revolution. Artificial worlds, immersive realities, experiences so precise they might erase the line between guest and character. "You'll walk through the movie," one developer said. "You'll live the dream." Somewhere, a lawyer drew up the patents. Somewhere else, an ethicist sighed. The new generation of storytellers, artists who had grown up with the castle's shadow on their walls, spoke of legacy as both compass and cage. "It's terrifying," one animator confessed. "You're drawing where giants have walked." But they drew anyway, because the empire, for all its contradictions, still offered what the world most needed, a place where imagination was treated like infrastructure. At corporate retreats, executives discussed sustainability and inclusivity, words that hadn't existed in Walt's lexicon, but would have intrigued him. Could fantasy save the planet? Could nostalgia be ethical? Could magic be fair? Questions that sounded poetic in boardrooms, but inched closer to prophecy outside. In Anaheim, Tokyo, Paris, Orlando, Hong Kong, Shanghai, the night shows continued. Fireworks painted skies with the same colors of wonder as they had in 1955. In the crowd, a mother lifted her child onto her shoulders. The child's eyes widened, the mother's eyes watered. Two generations met in the glow of a dream still under construction. The lamp pit is said that in the park, above the firehouse, the lamp in Walt's apartment never goes dark. Every evening, a worker turns it on. Every morning, guests look up and feel something they can't quite name. Some call it reverence, some call it sentiment, some call it hope. That light burns for more than one man. It burns for every artist who stayed late perfecting a frame no one else would notice, for every worker who swept Main Street after the parades, for Roy, who made sure the lights could stay on, for Lillian, who kept the door unlocked, for the families who paid to believe and the skeptics who came anyway and found themselves believing too. The lamp burns because stories, real stories, are never finished. They change hands, change hearts, change form. They outlive their makers. And though the empire has grown vast, wrapped in steel and servers and slogans, at its quietest center remains that same small glow. A mouse, a pencil, a dream drawn on the back of a grocery bill. The future will come, and it will come fast. The parks will expand, the screens will evolve, and the boundaries between fantasy and fact will blur further than ever. But somewhere, perhaps in a darkened theater or a child's bedroom, someone will whisper, "Once upon a time," and the spell will begin again. Because in the end, the empire of imagination was never about power. It was about permission, the permission to dream, to build, to believe. And as long as that lamp burns, the story continues. Not of a company, but of a family, of a world, of all of us who still, somehow, choose to wonder.